My name is Daniel Mercer, and for much of my adult life I have worked as a historian with a particular focus on maritime records and coastal communities. At present, I am 40, 2 years old, unmarried, and perhaps too consumed by archives, old sea charts, and crumbling notebooks that smell of salt and mildew. I should make clear that my life has not been one of daring voyages or grand discoveries. I have spent years poring over dull ledgers in quiet libraries, trying to reconstruct the patterns of ordinary lives lived along treacherous shores. And yet, there are moments when history chooses to thrust something upon us. Something not meant to be found, or at least not meant to be believed. The account I am about to share is one of those moments, and I am only now beginning to grasp how deeply it unsettled the course of my work, and perhaps even my sanity. The matter began 2 summers ago when I traveled to a small coastal town in Maine. The place was called Breakwater Cove, though it hardly appeared on modern maps except as a faint dot near a ragged peninsula that jutted into the Atlantic. The cove had once been a hub for fishing schooners and whaling expeditions, but by the 21st century it was little more than a withering hamlet with 2 diners, 1 bar, and a post office that looked like it hadn't been painted since the 1950s. I had come there not for leisure but for research, for Breakwater Cove had maintained a lighthouse for nearly 150 years, and I had been told that the local historical society was in possession of the former keeper's belongings. His name was Elias Grady, and though I had heard it only in passing before, there was something magnetic about the sound of it when the librarian first mentioned him. Grady had served as keeper of Breakwater Light from 1891 until 1932, a span of over 40 years, and he had lived alone on the island where the structure stood. According to town records, he died in his sleep at the age of 79, survived only by distant cousins in Massachusetts, who never claimed his effects. The town absorbed them into its archives, and most of his possessions, his weather gear, his lantern, his logbooks, gathered dust in the basement of the society's narrow brick building. I had requested to view these items while conducting research for a paper on lighthouse culture and the psychology of isolation. The society's curator, a brisk woman named Margaret Fletcher, unlocked the storage room for me one gray morning, handing me gloves and warning that the materials had been undisturbed for decades. The air inside was cool and smelled of paper, rope, and faint brine. Wooden crates were stacked in uneven columns. Some bore Grady's initials carved with a sailor's knife. Others simply bore shipping labels yellowed with time. It was within one of these crates that I discovered the journal. It was wrapped in oilcloth, stiff with age, and tied with cord that snapped when I pulled at it. The book was larger than I expected, its leather cracked and brittle, the pages swollen slightly as though they had once been damp. On the inside cover, in slanted handwriting, were the words "Property of Elias H. Grady, Keeper of Breakwater Light. Commenced this 4th day of November, 1901. I have spent enough years reading archaic script to know immediately when a document holds something personal. Logbooks often contain sterile details, wind direction, barometer readings, ships sighted. But Grady's handwriting, though careful, carried a nervous energy in its curves. I remember glancing up at Margaret and saying, perhaps too quickly, that I wished to examine the volume alone. She raised an eyebrow but agreed, telling me to lock up when I was finished. The first entries seemed ordinary enough. Grady recorded weather patterns, lamp maintenance, the occasional shipwreck off the rocky shoals. Yet by the time I reached January of 1902, the entries began to shift. His tone grew less formal, his observations stranger. He wrote of lights on the water that did not belong to any ship, of voices carried across the waves though the sea was empty, of knocks on the lighthouse door when no vessel was near. One passage made me stop entirely. It read, "There is a fog tonight unlike any I have seen. It does not roll in from the horizon but rises from beneath, seeping upward from the waves as though the ocean were exhaling. I hear the bell buoy though it is broken, and last night the glass in the lantern trembled not from wind, but from a sound deep below. I fear the sea has its own breath." I must admit, I felt a tremor in my own chest as I read those words. The rational part of me dismissed them as a man's lonely fancies, the kind of embellishments one invents when confined to a barren rock for decades. But another part of me, the part that had come to love maritime lore, leaned closer, compelled. I turned pages feverishly, following Grady as his nights became more troubled. He described a figure he sometimes saw on the water, a tall man in oilskins, standing upon the waves as though on invisible planks. Grady insisted the figure never moved closer, never spoke, but always watched from a distance, no matter the storm. He gave it a name, written in shaky letters, "The Watcher at Sea." I paused then, my gloved hand pressed flat upon the page. A gull shrieked outside the brick building, startling me. The notion of a solitary keeper, night after night, glimpsing such a figure on the water. It seemed the stuff of madness, and yet the detail with which he wrote was unsettling in its conviction. By late afternoon, I had read nearly 100 pages. The entries darkened steadily, shifting from curiosity to dread. Grady wrote of hearing knocks inside the lighthouse walls, though no one was there. He wrote of finding the sea charts rearranged on his desk, always depicting not the coast of Maine, but a crude outline of something like a spiral curling inward. He began to mark nights with the word chanting, followed by crude phonetic syllables that bore no resemblance to English. The last entry I read that day chilled me beyond measure. Dated September 7, 1907, it stated the watcher drew nearer last night. I heard his boots upon the rocks, though the tide was high. When I lit the lantern, the flame bent toward him as though yearning. I fear the light no longer serves ships, but him alone. God help me. I closed the journal then, my heart thudding uncomfortably. I told myself I had indulged enough for one day, that I should return with a clearer head. I rewrapped the book, though my hands shook, and placed it back in the crate. As I locked the storage room, Margaret asked if I had found anything of interest. I lied, saying the logbooks were routine, nothing more than weather notes. She gave me a look that suggested she knew I was withholding something, but she did not press. That night I could not sleep. At the inn where I stayed, the wind rattled the window frame, and every time I closed my eyes I saw the words scrawled in Grady's script. The Watcher at Sea. The following morning, despite fatigue, I returned to the archives. Margaret handed me the keys without question, though I thought I saw the faintest smile tug at her mouth. I went straight to the journal, opened to where I had left off, and plunged deeper into its pages. What I found would tether me to Breakwater Cove far longer than I intended, and would draw me into a mystery that, even now, I am unsure how to name. For Grady's journal was not merely the record of a man's isolation. It was a chronicle of something vast and unearthly that had touched our shores. And in reading it, I fear I invited that same thing into my own life. When I returned to the journal the second morning, I promised myself I would treat it with more detachment. My training demanded as much. After all, every archive contains strange corners, unreliable narrators, eccentric figures whose accounts blur fact and delusion. I told myself Elias Grady was one of those, an aging man alone for decades, his imagination perhaps warped by fog and solitude. Yet once I cracked the leather spine again, my conviction faltered. The entries that followed the September 1907 notation seemed to lurch into darker terrain. Grady no longer recorded the weather except in fragments. Instead, he focused on the figure he called the Watcher at Sea. Sometimes he described it as a silhouette against the horizon, at other times as close enough that he could see rivulets of water dripping from its coat, though no rain had fallen. The voice of the sea, he wrote, grew louder when the figure appeared, as if every wave struck the rocks in rhythm with a slow, deliberate breath. On October 3rd, 1907, he noted, I left bread upon the rock for gulls. In the morning it was gone, but no bird tracks marked the surface. Only 2 wet footprints, large bare, pointing toward the door. I did not open it until dawn. I set the book down at that moment, uneasy. The smell of salt seemed stronger in the storage room, though I knew that was impossible. My ears strained, foolishly, for some echo of surf through the brick walls. The town was a mile inland, yet a dull roar rang in my imagination, convincing enough to raise gooseflesh along my arms. I resumed reading, compelled despite myself. The winter of 1907 appeared brutal, ice locking the bay, storms battering the lighthouse. Grady recorded 3 shipwrecks within sight of the light, though, curiously, he claimed that none of the wrecked sailors were ever recovered. Town records did note several disappearances that year, but no bodies. Grady obsessed over this absence, repeating that the sea had swallowed whole what it normally would return. One passage unsettled me with particular force. The watcher stands closer. He does not walk so much as arrive, as though the sea carries him forward like driftwood. When I call out, my voice does not return to me. The fog eats it, but I hear him answer in syllables I cannot shape, syllables that curdle the lamp flame. I have not slept in 3 nights. The handwriting at this point grew jagged, less disciplined than earlier entries, ink blotted in corners. I pictured Grady hunched over his desk by lantern light, exhausted, trembling. Yet I could not dismiss his conviction. By spring of 1908, the entries thinned. Whole weeks passed with no writing. Then suddenly, in May, the journal revived with a frantic tone. It is not one, but many. Last night there were faces in the surf, half submerged, pale mouths open though no cries emerged. I shut the shutters, yet heard the chant within. I marked the words again. Oloran, Veith, Hask. They press against my teeth as I sleep. The syllables repeated throughout the following pages, sometimes alone, sometimes in strings. At times Grady drew crude diagrams, beside them spirals, jagged wave, like marks, a figure with arms outstretched. The repetition suggested obsession, perhaps madness. Yet the consistency unnerved me. I realized with a start that I had been whispering the syllables aloud without meaning to. My tongue fumbled them clumsily, but the shapes of the words lingered unpleasantly in my mouth. I shut the book and stepped away, pacing the storage room to shake the feeling. When I returned to my lodgings that evening, the sea wind carried a damp chill. I walked the beach to clear my mind, telling myself I had allowed superstition to tangle with scholarship. Yet as I strolled the strand, I noticed the tide had left odd markings in the sand, curved patterns not unlike the spirals in Grady's sketches. I crouched, examining them, and told myself they were only the result of eddies and wind. Still, I felt watched, as though the horizon itself bent toward me. The next morning I resumed my reading with renewed determination. I was historian first, dreamer second. That was my mantra. By 1910, Grady's entries became sporadic, but heavier with dread. He wrote of hearing knocks from beneath the floorboards, though the lighthouse stood on solid rock. He described water dripping inside his quarters when the walls were dry. Once he claimed the journal itself had been wet to the touch when he woke, though he had not left it open. One entry dated August 14, 1910. The light burned blue last night. Ships passed, but none sounded horns. I believe they no longer see the beam as men once did. I believe it shines only for them now. The watcher has followers in the deep, and the lamp guides them home. I paused here, unsettled by his use of them. The plural appeared more often from that point forward. Grady no longer described a lone figure but multitudes, sometimes glimpsed in the swell, sometimes pressing against the lighthouse glass. He wrote of faces appearing in the reflection of the lantern, though when he turned no one was there. The rational part of me knew isolation can corrode perception. Hallucinations, paranoia, religious fervor, all are common among solitary keepers. Yet another part of me wondered, if even one shred of his account was true, what did that mean for the waters off Breakwater Cove? As I reached the 1920s entries, I noticed his handwriting had steadied again. Age had slowed him, but his script regained a formal quality. He returned to recording tides and ship passages, almost as if he had chosen to suppress whatever haunted him. Years passed in tidy order. I began to think the earlier horrors had burned themselves out, leaving behind only a weary man resigned to his duties. Then, in 1927, the strangeness returned. There was a knock last night upon the door. Not with hand, but with stone, slow and heavy. I did not answer. In the morning I found shells arranged upon the step. They formed the spiral. They wait still. A month later, the spiral appears in the waves now. I see it spin against the current, dark water pulling inward. Gulls wheel above, then vanish. I count the moments until the silence after their wings. I count and count. The journal pages grew warped near this section, stained as though by seawater. I held them carefully, yet a faint dampness clung to my gloves, inexplicable after all these decades. The smell of brine returned sharper than before. I fought the urge to close the book and flee. Instead, I pressed on. I had to know where his account led. The year 1929 contained only 2 entries, both brief but chilling. February 20, I have begun to dream of doors in the waves. When I wake, the hinges creak though the sea is calm. September 990, the watcher no longer waits beyond. He stands in the lantern room. I cannot leave the stairs after dark. I closed the journal then, unable to continue for the day. My throat was tight, my pulse unsteady. I leaned against the storage shelves, trying to steady my breath. At that exact moment, a sound startled me, a faint tapping, as if from within the wall behind me. I froze, straining to listen. The sound repeated, irregular but deliberate tap, tap, pause, tap. My mind insisted it was a settling pipe, or a bird outside the brick. Yet the timing unnerved me, too precise, too much like the knocks Grady described. I shut the journal, rewrapped it, and returned the crate to its corner. When I emerged into daylight, the air smelled sharply of salt, though the ocean was miles away. That night, I dreamt. I stood on the breakwater, wind lashing my coat. Out on the water, a lantern swung, though no boat supported it. From the darkness rose a tall figure in oilskins, water pouring from him as though he were made of tide itself. He lifted his arm and pointed toward me. I could not see his face. Then the sea behind him opened, swirling into a spiral that plunged into blackness. From that spiral came voices, chanting the syllables I had read in the journal. The sound grew until it filled my head, pushing me toward the edge. I woke drenched in sweat, the sheets damp beneath me, as if I had dragged seawater into the bed. The window was open, though I had latched it. From the distance came the faint toll of a buoy bell, though I knew no bell remained on that coast. The next morning I returned to the Historical Society, driven less by scholarship now and more by obsession. Margaret handed me the keys silently, her eyes lingering on me as if she guessed my unrest. I reopened the journal to the final years. Grady's entries dwindled by 1930, but the ones he did write were stark. January 5th, 1930, they knock every night now. I do not light the lantern, yet still the flame burns. I think it is no longer mine to command. May 18, a ship passed, its deck empty. Yet I heard the voices of 100 sailors. I covered my ears, but still they spoke within. The last legible entry came in March 1932. The watcher has opened the door. I am keeper no longer. The sea keeps itself. I go to meet him. After that, only blank pages remained. Grady died later that year, reportedly of natural causes, found in his bunk with the lamp still burning above. I shut the journal slowly, shaken. It felt less like history and more like testimony, left for someone to uncover. And I had uncovered it. I wondered then if Margaret had known. Her curious glance, her half-smile, had she read the book herself? Had she chosen to let me bear its burden next? That evening, unable to resist, I walked to the shoreline again. The tide was high, the waves restless. I scanned the horizon, searching for any trace of light. For several minutes nothing appeared. Then, faint and distant, I thought I saw a lantern sway above the surf, just as in my dream. It blinked once, twice, as though in signal. I turned away quickly, heart hammering, and hurried back to town. Yet I knew I would return. The journal had not finished with me. For the first time in my life, history did not feel like the past. It felt like something alive, pressing against the present, demanding witness. And I feared, deeply, that Grady's watcher now had mine. Sleep abandoned me after that second night of reading. My dreams tangled with Grady's visions, until I could hardly tell whether I was recalling his words or my own imaginings. I paced the narrow inn room, listening to the wind, hearing in it the rhythm of distant waves. At dawn, I made my decision. Scholarship no longer satisfied me. If I wanted to understand the truth of Elias Grady's journal, I needed to see breakwater light with my own eyes. The island sat half a mile from shore, a jagged spur of rock clawing upward from the Atlantic. The locals called it Grady's Rock, though on nautical charts it bore only a code number. A rusting dock jutted from its southern edge, long unused. I inquired about hiring a boat to take me out, but the fishermen at the bar shook their heads almost in unison. One man spat into his glass and muttered, "Best left alone." Another, older, said simply, "That place don't want visitors." Finally, a younger lobsterman named Kyle agreed to ferry me, though only in daylight and only if I paid twice his asking rate. "Won't linger near that rock," he said, his eyes sliding away from mine. "I'll drop you in circle until you wave me back. No more." I agreed at once. Money meant little compared to the pull of that crumbling tower waiting across the water. We set out in a small skiff under a sky the color of pewter. The sea smelled raw, the waves slapping hard against the hull. As we neared the island, the lighthouse rose from mist. Tall, whitewashed once but now mottled with salt stains, its lantern room capped in rust. Windows gaped like empty sockets. A gull wheeled above, crying mournfully, then veered away as if repelled. Kyle refused to approach the dock. He cut the engine 50 yards out and tossed me a rope ladder, his mouth tight. "I'll be circling," he said. "Don't be long." Climbing onto that island felt like stepping outside time. The rocks slicked beneath my boots, crusted with barnacles. Grass grew in patchy tufts, yellowed by salt. The lighthouse loomed ahead, its door warped but still intact. I hesitated only a moment before pushing it open. The hinges groaned like a long sigh. Inside, the air was stale, thick with mildew and the faint tang of oil. My flashlight beam swept across stone walls. A narrow stair curling upward, and a room at the base with a desk collapsed against one wall. Papers lay scattered, long since dissolved into pulp. A broken lantern hung from a hook, its glass fractured. I felt an uncanny hush, as if the building itself listened. Even the sea outside seemed muffled. My heart thudded, loud in my ears. I began to climb. Each step creaked under my weight, though the structure held firm. Midway up I paused, touching the wall. Dampness slicked my palm. The smell of brine intensified. At last I reached the lantern room. The glass panes were cracked but intact, the great lamp long extinguished. Rust streaked the iron framework. From here the view stretched across endless gray water, the horizon blurred in mist. For a moment I simply stood, imagining Grady here night after night, alone with his lamp and his thoughts. Then I noticed something scratched into the metal railing. I crouched, running my gloved fingers over the etched grooves. Spirals, dozens of them overlapping, carved deep by a steady hand. Some small, others wide, all curling inward. My stomach clenched. A sudden knock startled me. I spun, light flashing. The sound had come from beneath my feet, from the stairwell below. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate. My mouth went dry. "Kyle," I called, though I knew he would never have entered. Silence answered. I gripped the railing to steady myself. The spirals seemed to shimmer in my vision, as if wet. My pulse hammered. Then, faint but unmistakable, I heard a voice carried up through the stairwell. Low, guttural syllables, Ulleran. "Vaeth, Hask." I stumbled back, nearly tripping. The chant ceased abruptly, swallowed by silence. I forced myself down the stairs, each step an agony of nerves. The base of the tower yawned empty. No intruder, no footprints in the dust. Yet on the inside of the door, in streaks of moisture, the spiral had formed again. Fresh, glistening, I fled. Bursting into daylight, I waved furiously at Kyle's circling boat. He maneuvered closer, frowning at my pale face. Didn't take long, he muttered as I clambered aboard. He didn't ask what I had seen, and I offered nothing. The relief of leaving that island felt almost physical, like shedding a weight. But the relief did not last. That night, back at the inn, I dreamed again. I stood in the lantern room. The spirals on the railing spun, slowly at first, then faster, dragging my gaze inward. Beyond the glass, the sea boiled. Figures rose from it. Men and women in tattered oilskins, faces half rotted, eyes like drowned marbles. They lifted their arms toward the light. Behind them towered the Watcher. Taller than the rest, water cascading endlessly from his coat. He lifted his head, and though his face was featureless, I felt his gaze pierce me. I woke with a cry, my throat raw. The window rattled, though the night was calm. On the floor beside my bed lay wet footprints, leading from the window to the door. I did not sleep again. The following morning I returned to the Historical Society. Margaret was waiting, as though she had anticipated me. She studied my haggard expression and said, "You went to the lighthouse." I hesitated, then nodded. "You knew I would." She did not deny it. Instead, she led me to the basement again. "There is more you should see," she said. From a locked cabinet, she produced a smaller notebook, its cover plain but marked with Grady's initials. "This was never catalogued," she admitted. "Too unsettling. But if you've read the journal and braved the tower, you deserve the rest." I opened it with trembling hands. The writing inside was harsher, frantic. It appeared to be Grady's private record, hidden from official logs. December 12, 1931. See, they come each night now. I no longer fight sleep. In dreams I join them, walking the seabed, the spiral above. They show me the door. Soon it will open. January 3, 1932, the Watcher spoke my name. Not in sound, but in tide. I felt it in my bones. He says the light belongs to him. He says I must keep the door until he calls me through. The final page bore only one sentence, scratched so hard the paper nearly tore. "The sea remembers what we forget." I closed the notebook slowly, my stomach turning. Margaret watched me without expression. "Do you see now why no one in this town sets foot on that island?" she asked. I could only nod. Words deserted me. Yet even as dread filled me, another force rose, stronger fascination. A historian lives for mysteries, and this one was unlike any I had ever known. If Grady's writings were true, even partly, they suggested something vast lurking beyond human knowledge. If they were delusions, then they were delusions contagious enough to infect me. Either way, I could not let go. I spent the next week combing through town archives, shipping records, newspapers from the early 1900s. Patterns emerged. Dozens of vessels reported seeing strange lights near Breakwater Cove. Several noted their compasses spinning erratically within sight of the lighthouse. Between 1907 and 1932, more than 20 fishermen disappeared without trace near those waters. None of this had been tied directly to Grady, yet the overlap with his journal was undeniable. I questioned locals, though most refused to speak. One elderly woman, Mrs. Crawley, finally whispered, "My father used to say the sea out there had a hunger. Said Grady wasn't its keeper, he was its servant." Her words clung to me like seaweed. At night, the dreams continued. Always the spiral, always the watcher. Sometimes I woke to find my hand tracing circles on the sheets. Once I found a scrap of paper on the desk with the syllables written in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of doing so. I began to fear sleep itself. Yet exhaustion always won. On the 8th night, the dream shifted. I stood not in the lighthouse but beneath the sea. The water pressed against me, but did not drown me. Before me yawned a vast doorway carved into stone, its edges glowing faintly. Figures moved within, their shapes indistinct, flowing. The watcher stood at the threshold, arm raised as if inviting me, and behind him I saw Grady, old, bent, but unmistakable, his eyes wide, his mouth moving in silent chant. I woke gasping, salt on my tongue. My pillow was damp, though the roof did not leak. The next day I returned to the docks, searching for Kyle. When I told him I needed to visit the lighthouse again, he recoiled. "Not a chance," he said. "Once was too many." I offered triple pay. He shook his head. No amount. Desperation clawed at me. I asked every fisherman, every boy with a skiff. All refused. Word spread quickly, and soon men turned away when I approached. The town had closed ranks. Margaret alone did not. She found me at the inn that evening, eyes sharp. "If you insist on returning, you'll have to row yourself. There's an old dory on the beach. But I warn you, what waits out there is not history, it's hunger." Her words might have stopped a wiser man, but obsession had me firmly in its grip. That night, I stood on the beach beside the dory, the tide swelling dark under a moonless sky. The wind carried the faint toll of a buoy bell, though none remained. I pushed the boat into the surf, my hands steady despite the fear gnawing my chest. The sea accepted me, lifting the dory like a toy. I set the oars and began to row toward the black silhouette of breakwater light. The spiral waited. The sea was black glass, reflecting nothing, swallowing everything. Each pull of the oars sent tremors through my arms, though the rhythm steadied me. Behind me, Breakwater Cove dwindled to a faint cluster of lights along the shore. Ahead, the lighthouse loomed darker than the night itself, a column of shadow rising from jagged rock. I had rowed across waters before, in calmer contexts, but this passage felt weighted, as though every stroke drew me deeper into something not meant for human trespass. The air grew heavy, the silence profound. Even the usual cries of gulls or the slap of waves against the hull fell away. Only the faint groan of oarlocks broke the hush. As I neared the island, the tower's outline sharpened. A weak shimmer pulsed at the lantern room. Impossible, for no lamp had burned there in decades. The light did not beam outward as a proper beacon would. Instead, it seemed to seep, as if glowing within the fog itself, breathing. The dory scraped against the dock with a hollow thud. I tied it quickly, though the knot trembled under my fingers. My boots struck the warped planks, then the slick rocks. The smell of brine hit stronger than before, tinged with rot. I climbed the narrow path to the door of the lighthouse, which stood ajar as though expecting me. Inside, darkness swallowed my flashlight beam. The air dripped with damp, salt clinging to every surface. I began to climb the spiral stairs, each step echoing unnaturally, as though the tower were amplifying my intrusion. Midway up, I paused. A sound rose beneath the steady creak of the stair. Knocks again, deliberate, resonant. Not from below this time, but from within the walls. I pressed my ear to the cold stone. The knocks repeated, then shifted into a pattern, almost like words. 3 taps, pause. 2 taps. My breath caught. I forced myself upward, each step an act of will. At last I reached the lantern room. The spirals carved into the railing still gleamed faintly, though no moisture should have remained after all these years. I stepped closer, shining my light across the cracked glass. Beyond lay only the dark ocean, yet my pulse quickened as though eyes watched from every wave. Then the chant began. Low at first, barely audible, then swelling, layered voices rising from the sea. The syllables I knew too well: Oloran, Vaeth, Hask. They rolled like the tide itself, pressing into the glass, rattling the metal framework. My knees weakened, but I clung to the railing, and then I saw him. The Watcher stood upon the water, nearer than ever, towering, drenched yet untouched by the swell. His oilskins dripped endlessly, his head tilted upward toward the lantern. Around him others surfaced, scores of figures in ruined coats, faces white as foam, eyes black hollows. They lifted their arms in unison, chanting, their mouths wide though the voices rose from beneath the waves, not from their throats. The spirals on the railing began to turn. I swear they moved, spinning inward, dragging my gaze until the world itself seemed to swirl. The glass panes of the lantern room vibrated, light seeping through cracks though no flame burned. I staggered back. My flashlight flickered, then died. In its absence, the room glowed faintly, not from any natural source but from the spirals themselves. Their light pulsed like a heartbeat. The chant swelled. My name echoed within it. Daniel, drawn out, distorted, carried by dozens of voices. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the sound seeped through bone. Panic seized me. I fled down the stairs, stumbling in the dark. The knocks followed, thudding in the walls beside me, keeping pace. By the time I burst through the door into the night, my lungs burned. The sea writhed below, black water churning though no wind blew. The Watcher still stood nearer now, his arm raised toward me. Behind him the ocean spun into a spiral vast as the horizon, a whirlpool glowing faintly from its depths. I ran for the dock, desperate to untie the dory. But the rope was slick, my fingers fumbling. The chant rolled louder, vibrating the planks underfoot. At last the knot gave. I shoved the boat into the water and leapt in, rowing furiously. I dared not look back, but I felt the pull of the spiral behind me, a current tugging the oars. The sea grew viscous, heavy, each stroke weaker than the last. My arms screamed with strain. Then, impossibly, silence. The chant ceased. The water calmed. My boat drifted free, sliding across still surface. When I turned, the island loomed in shadow, the lighthouse extinguished. No spiral churned, no Watcher stood. Only the ordinary hush of night remained. By the time I reached shore, dawn had broken. The townsfolk avoided my eyes as I staggered through the streets, soaked and shaking. At the inn, Margaret waited. She did not look surprised. "You went back?" she said. I nodded numbly. "And now?" she continued. "You understand why Grady never left that tower? Why he wrote as he did?" I tried to answer, but my voice broke. All I could whisper was, "It knows my name." Her gaze softened, though no comfort lay in it. "Then you must leave Breakwater Cove, tonight, before it calls you back." I wanted to obey. Truly I did, but obsession had taken root too deep. Even as I packed my things, I knew I would not leave. Something in the journal, in the spirals, in the Watcher's gaze, it tethered me. That night I did not sleep. Instead, I returned to the Historical Society alone, unlocking the basement with trembling hands. I pulled the journal from its crate, laying it open on the table. The pages shimmered faintly under the lamp, and there, in the margin of a blank page I had not noticed before, new words had appeared. The ink was fresh, glistening. Daniel Mercer, Keeper. My knees buckled. I clutched the edge of the table, heart pounding. The journal lay silent, but the letters remained undeniable. My name inscribed by a hand long dead, or something far older. I closed the book carefully, wrapping it in the oilcloth again. My decision was made before I realized it. The lighthouse was waiting. I should have fled. That would have been the sane choice, the human choice. Pack my belongings, catch the morning train inland, leave Breakwater Cove behind me as nothing more than a fever dream. But sanity is fragile when you have stared too long into another man's madness and found your own reflection there. The word on the journal's page: Daniel Mercer, keeper, burned behind my eyes. I told myself perhaps I had imagined it, that exhaustion had conjured the letters. Yet when I returned the next morning, the ink remained dark, the curves unmistakably real. My name, branded into Grady's account as though his hand had reached through decades to claim me. I tried to tell Margaret. She listened quietly, her expression unreadable, and when I finished she only said, "It has chosen." The finality of her words chilled me. "What do you mean?" I demanded. She folded her hands on the desk. "The lighthouse doesn't simply stand abandoned. Someone always answers when it calls. Grady was not the first, though he was the longest. And now, it seems you are next." Her calmness infuriated me. "You knew. All along you knew what that journal was." Her gaze did not waver. "Would you have believed me if I had told you on the first day? Or would you have dismissed me as another superstitious local?" I could not answer. She leaned closer, her voice low. "If you go back again, Daniel, you will not return. That is the truth. But if you leave now, tonight, you may yet escape its reach." I left the Historical Society without replying, her words rattling in my skull. Escape. But how do you escape something that has already written your name? That evening, the town seemed to hold its breath as I walked its narrow streets. Doors shut quickly as I passed. Curtains twitched closed. They knew. Perhaps they had always known. At the inn I tried to sleep, but the dream came again. The spiral churned beneath the waves, glowing faintly. The watcher raised his arm. Beside him stood Elias Grady, his eyes pale, his lips moving in silent chant. This time, when I tried to turn away, my body would not obey. The spiral pulled at me, stronger than ever, dragging me forward into its center. I woke gasping, my throat raw, the taste of salt heavy on my tongue. My hands clutched the sheets in tight spirals, twisted into knots. The decision was made. I rose, dressed, and walked to the beach. The same dory lay half buried in sand, waiting as though it had never been moved. I pushed it into the surf. The tide accepted me, lifting the boat gently, almost tenderly. The row to the island was easier than before. The water carried me forward, the current in my favor, as though eager to return me to the tower. The lighthouse grew larger, its dark silhouette crowned with a faint glow at the lantern room. The dock welcomed me with hollow groans. I climbed the rocks, each step sure despite the slickness. The door of the lighthouse stood open wide now, no longer needing invitation. Inside, the stairwell glowed faintly. Spirals shimmered on the stone, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. I climbed slowly, reverently, as though entering a sanctuary. At the lantern room, the spirals carved into the railing spun steadily, their glow stronger than before. The cracked glass trembled in time with the chant that rose faintly from the sea below. The watcher stood upon the waves, closer now, his form towering. Behind him dozens, no hundreds, of figures surfaced, their mouths open, their eyes vacant. They lifted their arms, beckoning. And then, for the first time, I heard my name from the watcher's mouth. Not whispered in my mind, but spoken aloud, booming, carried by the sea itself. "Daniel." I staggered, tears springing unbidden to my eyes. My legs trembled, yet I could not step back. The spiral's glow embraced me. Then I felt a presence behind me. Slowly I turned. Elias Grady stood in the stairwell. His hair was white, his skin pale as salt, his eyes milky, yet his form was solid, not ghost but flesh. Water dripped steadily from his coat, pooling on the floor. His lips moved, shaping the chant Ularan. Vaeth. Hask. I tried to speak, to ask what he wanted, but no words came. My throat constricted. Grady stepped closer, his hand rising, palm open. I felt the weight of years of duty, of something passed from one to another. His voice, cracked and ancient, rasped one word, Keeper. The spirals flared, the chant roared, and then the lantern ignited. Not with flame, but with a cold blue light that poured outward, flooding the sea. The figures below screamed soundlessly, their mouths wide, their arms reaching. The watcher raised both arms high, triumphant. The spiral in the water deepened, its pull immense. I clutched the railing, my body shaking. Part of me wanted to flee, to cast myself down the stairs and run. But another part, deeper and stronger, knew the truth. I was no longer a visitor. I was part of the tower now, claimed as surely as Grady had been. The light burned through the night, steady and unyielding. Ships far offshore might have seen it, though no horn answered. The lamp was not for them, it was for the watcher and his horde. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time lost meaning in that glow. At some point Grady vanished, fading like mist, leaving me alone in the lantern room. Yet his presence lingered in every stone, every spiral. When dawn came, the light extinguished itself, the spirals dimmed. The chant faded into the hush of waves. I descended the stairs slowly, my legs stiff. At the base, the door had closed behind me. I pushed it open, stepping into pale daylight. The sea lay calm, ordinary. The dock creaked gently. I returned to the dory and rowed back to shore. No current hindered me this time. The town rose ahead, still and silent. When I set foot on the beach, Margaret was waiting. She studied me carefully, her eyes shadowed. "You went back," she said, her voice almost pitying. I nodded. "You lit the lamp." I could not deny it. The taste of salt lingered on my lips, the glow of the spirals still etched behind my eyelids. Her shoulders sagged. "Then it is done. You are keeper now." I wanted to argue, to shout that I was no servant, that I still had choices. But even as the words formed, I knew they were lies. The lighthouse had claimed me. That night I returned to the inn, but I did not sleep. Instead, I sat at the desk and opened a blank notebook. My hand trembled as I wrote the first words. Property of Daniel Mercer, keeper of Breakwater Light. Commenced this day, the 5th of October 20. The pen scratched steadily, almost of its own accord. Outside, though the night was clear, I heard the toll of a buoy bell that had not existed for decades. The spiral waits. I had thought taking up the pen would grant me distance, the way historians shield themselves behind their notes. But the act of writing did not free me. It bound me tighter. Every word pulled me deeper, as though the spiral etched itself across the page through my hand. I told myself I was documenting, recording, but the truth was clearer with each sentence. I was continuing Grady's work. Days passed, though I barely tracked them. The town avoided me now. Men turned their shoulders as I walked the street. Women drew their children indoors. Even Margaret, who had once met my gaze unflinching, lowered her eyes when I approached. They knew what I had become. They had seen it before. At night the dreams grew more vivid. No longer did I merely watch the spiral. I walked its edge, circling slowly as the sea parted to reveal a door of stone yawning beneath. Figures trailed me, hundreds, their mouths open in silent chant. At the door stood the watcher, waiting. Patient, always patient. Each dawn I woke with the smell of salt in my throat, my sheets damp. Once, when I blinked against the morning light, I found grains of sand scattered across my pillow. I fought to cling to my old self, to Daniel Mercer, historian, rational man. I reread Grady's journals, searching for some passage I might have overlooked, some clue to resisting. Yet each time I opened the book, I found new entries that had not been there before, entries written in my own hand, though I had no memory of writing them. October 10, heard of the lamp waits. October 11, the sea speaks in spirals. October 12, keeper keeps. I slammed the journal shut, my chest heaving. The ink was fresh, the words undeniable. I had become what I had once studied, a man slipping beyond the boundary of reason. Still, part of me clung to defiance. I resolved to test the hold of the lighthouse. I would not row to the island. I would stay in the inn, lock the door, bar the windows. For 3 days I kept to this, venturing only for food. The sea called faintly, but I resisted. On the 4th night, I woke standing on the beach, the tide licking at my boots. The dory floated before me, its rope slack, though I had sworn it was tied fast. My hands ached from gripping the oars, though I had no memory of rowing. The horizon glowed faintly, a cold blue pulse. I stumbled back into town, shaken. Escape was no longer possible, whether waking or sleeping. The call would have me. The next evening, Margaret came to me. She did not knock, but entered quietly, setting herself across from me at the inn's table. Her face was pale, her eyes tired. "You cannot fight it," she said softly. "Then what do you suggest?" I snapped. My voice sounded harsh, not entirely my own. She studied me for a long moment. Some keepers last longer than others. Grady endured 40 years. Perhaps you will too. Her words chilled me more than any storm. To endure was not to live, it was to serve. I rose suddenly, anger coursing through me. "And what of you? Do you simply watch? Allow this to continue, generation after generation?" Her lips pressed thin. "We have no choice. The sea chooses. The town survives by yielding. Better one man than all." I turned from her, rage and despair colliding. I wanted to curse her, to curse the town, to curse Grady. But when I opened my mouth, only one word came: keeper. She flinched, then stood and left without another word. That night I returned to the beach willingly. The spiral pulsed faintly across the water, beckoning. I rowed without resistance, the oars moving smoothly, the sea calm as glass. The lighthouse welcomed me. The door swung wide, the stairs glowed faintly, the spirals on the walls pulsed in greeting. I climbed with steady steps, no longer trembling. At the lantern room, the watcher stood upon the sea, closer than ever. Behind him, the multitude rose, their chants shaking the air. My name echoed in their voices. Grady stood at my side, no longer old, no longer frail, but strong and sure. His eyes burned faintly blue. He looked at me with something like pride. Together we placed our hands upon the railing. The spirals flared, the lamp ignited, and the light poured outward in a beam that split the night. The sea roared in answer, the spiral churning vast and deep. The watcher raised both arms, and the multitude sank beneath the waves as though passing through a door. Only the chant remained, filling the air, filling me. In that moment I understood. The lighthouse did not guard against the sea, it invited it. The lamp was not a warning for ships, but a summons for what lay below. The keeper's duty was not to protect, but to serve as conduit, as witness, as host. And I was keeper now. The nights blur together after that. Each evening the lamp burns, each morning extinguishes. Ships pass rarely, and those that do never sound horns. Perhaps they see nothing. Perhaps they see too much. I no longer know. The townsfolk avert their eyes when I come ashore, but they bring supplies, leaving them on the dock without a word. They understand the bargain, as Margaret said. One man for many. I keep the journal. Its pages fill steadily, though I cannot always recall writing. The spirals etch themselves across the margins. The syllables repeat endlessly: Olerin, Vaeth, Hask. Sometimes I read back and find words not mine, yet in my hand. The watcher remains patient. He does not demand, only waits, always waits. The spiral grows each night, and I feel its pull stronger. One day, as it did with Grady, it will open fully. On that day I will step through, leaving the tower behind. Until then, I serve. If you should find these pages, know this: the sea remembers what we forget. The lighthouse is no ruin, no relic. It is a door, and every door has its keeper. Now it is me, but someday it will be you. My name is Daniel Mercer. I am 34 years old, and I was born and raised in a small mining town in Nevada that has clung stubbornly to survival long after the veins of silver and gold ran dry. My father worked in the pits when he was young, and my grandfather before him, though by the time I was old enough to ask questions, the shafts had been sealed, the equipment auctioned, and the town had turned into little more than a stopover for tourists chasing ghost stories. I never planned on staying here forever. I went away for college, earned a degree, tried to build a life elsewhere, but somehow I drifted back. Maybe it was gravity, maybe guilt. My mother passed, my father's health declined, and the house was still standing. I found work where I could, odd jobs mostly, and spent evenings wandering the edges of town where the desert pressed close and the mountains threw long shadows. Out there, you can feel how thin the line is between past and present. Abandoned shacks tilt in the dust, rusted rail tracks vanish into sagebrush, and if you know where to look, the mouths of mines gape black in the rock. Everyone here grows up with rules drilled into them. Don't go near the shafts, don't break the seals, don't disturb what's been shut away. On faded metal signs, bolted crooked to fence posts or leaning against cairns of rock, the warning is simpler and harsher. Stia you. But people are people. Teenagers dare each other, drifters poke around, urban explorers show up with cameras and flashlights. Every year or two, someone gets lost or hurt, and the sheriff gives the same wary speech to the local paper. And still the mines sit there waiting. I used to obey the rule without question. Even when friends teased me in high school, even when I followed them as far as the fences and watched them crawl under, I never crossed. Something about the dark holes in the mountain stirred a dread I couldn't shake. It wasn't just the fear of collapse or bad air. It felt older, heavier, like standing at the edge of a cliff while something inside you whispers to jump. That dread might have kept me safe forever, if not for what happened this spring. It started with a letter. I was at the house one afternoon sorting through bills when I found the envelope wedged beneath the stack. No return address, only my name written in uneven block letters across the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle, with handwriting so shaky I could barely make out the words. Daniel, if you still live near the mountains, there is something you must see. The mine off Cutter's Pass was never closed right. They put boards over it, but the boards won't hold. If you hear the wind, don't follow it. If you see the light, don't trust it. But if you go, remember you must not stay past the third chamber. A friend, I read it 3 times, my chest tightening with each pass. Cutter's Pass was a narrow trail a few miles north, a place I'd driven by countless times but never hiked. There were dozens of abandoned shafts up there, though I couldn't remember anyone mentioning one that was only boarded up. Most had been filled or sealed with concrete decades ago. The phrasing was strange. If you hear the wind, don't follow it. If you see the light, don't trust it. It sounded like a riddle, or the kind of orulas list you see on creepy message boards online. Yet the warning about the third chamber was specific. Someone wanted me to find this place, but also to hold back. I almost threw the letter away. But that night, lying awake with the desert wind rattling against the siding, I kept picturing the sealed boards, flimsy and splintering, hiding a blackness that hadn't been touched in years. I thought about my grandfather, who never spoke of his mining days except to mutter, "There are places the earth wants shut." By morning, I'd made up my mind. I told myself I was just going to look, just to see if the shaft really existed, to satisfy my curiosity, and then leave it alone. I set out with a flashlight, a bottle of water, and my old hiking boots. I didn't tell my father. He still dozed in the recliner when I slipped out. The sky was pale blue, the air already heating with the promise of desert noon. Cutter's Pass was quiet when I parked the truck at the trailhead. The path wound upward through shale and low junipers, the kind of switchback climb that leaves you short of breath, even if you've done it before. I had the place to myself, no other hikers, no distant hum of ATVs, only the sound of my boots crunching rock and the faint hiss of wind. I almost missed the mine. Halfway up where the trail curved along a bluff, I noticed a break in the rock face, a dark cleft partially hidden by scrub. I pushed closer, and there it was, boards nailed crudely across an opening, edges weathered gray. Rusted wire wrapped the slats, but several strands had snapped, leaving gaps wide enough to peer through. Cold air seeped out, not the natural coolness of shade, but a damp, almost metallic breath that brushed my skin. The sign nearby had fallen, its paint faded, but I could still read the letters stamped in red STAOUT. I should have turned back. Every instinct in me screamed it, but the letter in my pocket felt like a weight pulling me forward. I pulled my gloves on, pried at the wire, and after some effort, one of the boards cracked loose. The opening yawned before me. Inside was darkness so thick it looked solid. I clicked on my flashlight, its beam cutting a narrow path, and ducked under the remaining boards. My boots crunched onto old timbers laid across the ground, remnants of the support flooring. The air smelled of wet stone and something else, like iron left to rust. I told myself I would only walk a little way, just far enough to see if there really were chambers. The tunnel sloped gently downward. Wooden beams lined the walls at intervals, most sagging but still upright. My light swept over rusted nails, graffiti carved into the wood, initials and dates that blurred together. The deeper I went, the more the world above felt distant, muffled. My own breath grew loud, echoing. Then came the first chamber. It opened abruptly, a round space carved by pickaxes long ago. The ceiling arched high, and broken carts sat rusting in the corners. Old lantern hooks jutted from the walls. In the center, a pile of stone rubble looked freshly shifted, as if someone had dug through recently. I stood listening. The silence pressed heavy, but underneath it I swore I heard something faint, a soft movement of air, like a sigh. My mind leapt to the letter. If you hear the wind, don't follow it. I clenched the flashlight tighter and stepped back into the tunnel. The second chamber came after another stretch of sloping passage. This one was smaller, more irregular, with walls glistening damp. A single rail track ended there, the rusted steel disappearing into the stone where the tunnel collapsed. I swept my light across the floor and froze. Footprints. They weren't old scuffs coated in dust. They were clear, sharp, pressed into the dirt, as if someone had walked through recently. And they didn't lead back toward the entrance. They went deeper, toward the far wall where a narrow fissure cracked open, just wide enough to squeeze through. I hesitated. Whoever left those prints might still be down here. Or maybe it was just another explorer who had come and gone. Yet the letter had said don't stay past the third chamber. And here I was, already closer than I'd meant to be. I should have turned around. Instead, I ducked through the fissure. The rock scraped my shoulders, and for a few moments the beam of my flashlight bounced wildly off stone as I shuffled sideways. Then the space opened, and I stepped into the third chamber. It was nothing like the others. The walls curved smoothly, almost as if the stone had melted and hardened again. Veins of quartz glimmered faintly, catching the light. At the center of the floor was a hole, perfectly circular, descending straight down into blackness. Cold air rose from it, carrying that same metallic tang. The footprints circled the hole once and then vanished. I edged closer, shining my beam into the depths. The light fell, but the shaft seemed bottomless. The air rising out carried a faint whispering sound, like many voices overlapping just below hearing. I staggered back, heart pounding. My legs wanted to bolt, but my gaze caught on something scratched into the rock near the hole. Words, scrawled with frantic strokes. Don't listen. The letters' warnings crashed in my head. Don't follow the wind. Don't trust the light. Don't stay past the third chamber. I stumbled toward the fissure, desperate to get out, when the beam of my flashlight flickered. It sputtered once, twice, and died. Darkness swallowed me whole. I slapped the flashlight, twisted the cap, but nothing worked. My breathing turned ragged. Then, out of the black, a glow bloomed. It was faint at first, a bluish shimmer rising from the hole at the chamber's center. It pulsed gently, as though alive, and with it came the whispering. Clearer now, curling into words I almost understood. My skin crawled. I remembered the letter, "If you see the light, don't trust it." But the glow tugged at me, soft and insistent, like the tide pulling at a swimmer. My feet shifted before I could stop them. That was when I heard the voice. Not a whisper now, but sharp and close, right by my ear. "Daniel." I spun, but there was no one there. Only darkness and the slow pulse of blue from the pit. Panic surged. I forced myself through the fissure, scraping my arms raw, and staggered back into the second chamber. The darkness felt thicker now, pressing against me. I ran blind until the beam of daylight ahead finally pierced the tunnel. When I burst out into the sun, I collapsed against the rocks, gulping the dry desert air like a drowning man. My hands shook so badly I dropped the flashlight. For a long time I just sat there, staring back at the dark slit in the mountain. The boards leaned useless, the broken wire swaying gently in the breeze. Nothing marked what lay inside. No one would believe what I'd seen. I told myself I would never go back. That whatever called my name down there could stay in the dark forever. But the letter still sits on my nightstand. And every night since, when the wind rattles the house, I swear I hear my name carried with it. I tried to convince myself it had been a trick of nerves. Darkness plays on the mind, echoes twist into words, and when you want to hear your name, you'll find it in any sound. That's what I repeated to myself for the next 2 days, moving through the house like nothing had changed. But something had. The letter on my nightstand felt heavier each morning, as though the paper itself absorbed weight. At night, the desert wind that usually rattled harmlessly against the siding now carried a cadence I couldn't ignore. Sometimes it was only a drawn-out sigh, other times a pattern like syllables. I left the radio on to drown it out, but when I woke near dawn the static seemed to shape itself around a single word: Daniel. On the third night, I dreamed of the hole in the third chamber. In the dream, the glow rose higher, swelling like a tide. From its depths, pale hands reached upward, clawing the air, their fingers impossibly long. I woke gasping, nails dug into my palms. The rational part of me whispered, "You went in once. You saw too much. Don't tempt it again." But the other part, the part that couldn't stop replaying the feel of that cold air, the whispering chorus, the voice, kept asking questions. Who sent the letter? Why warn me about the third chamber but not about the light? And if the hole was so dangerous, why had someone gone far enough to carve Dode, lost on into the stone? By the fourth day, I was carrying the flashlight everywhere, even in daylight. My father noticed. "You look like you're waiting for something," he said from his recliner, his thin face pale under the lamplight. "Just restless," I told him. He studied me for a long moment. "Your grandfather used to look that way." right before he'd vanish for hours up near the ridges. He said the mines called to him. I froze, called. My father nodded slowly. He never explained what he meant, just that the mountains weren't quiet. You'll do well not to listen if they start calling you. That night I decided I couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. I packed carefully this time. 2 flashlights, extra batteries, chalk to mark the walls, and my old camping lantern. I told myself I wasn't going deeper. I only wanted to document what I'd seen, maybe take photos to prove it wasn't just a dream. The thought steadied me. Evidence has weight. Evidence can anchor you to the real. The hike up Cutter's Pass felt different. The sun was lower, the air cooler, and every gust of wind seemed to carry grit that stung my eyes. When I reached the boarded shaft, I half expected the entrance to be sealed again, the boards replaced. But no, the slats hung exactly as I'd left them, wire dangling loose. I ducked inside. The first chamber was unchanged, rubble piled in the center. I paused long enough to scrawl an arrow on the wall with chalk before pressing onward. The second chamber still bore the footprints, though some edges had blurred. My throat tightened. Whoever made them had been there more than once. The fissure yawned ahead, black and narrow. My lantern swung against my leg, its flame casting jittery shadows. I told myself I would only look into the third chamber again, just long enough to confirm what I'd seen, and then leave. The space swallowed me as I stepped through. The hole still gaped at the center, rim smooth as though polished. The air rising from it was colder than before, carrying that metallic tang stronger now, sharp enough to sting the back of my throat. I forced myself closer, shining both flashlights down. The beams vanished into depth, devoured. No bottom revealed itself. No glow stirred. Relief flickered. Maybe the light had only been a trick of a dying battery. Maybe the whispers were the blood rushing in my ears. Then I noticed the markings. Not just the frantic daunt, Lusten carved near the rim, but dozens more, etched into the walls surrounding the chamber. Some shallow and shaky, others deep and deliberate. Symbols I didn't recognize. Circles crossed with jagged lines, spirals that turned inward until they vanished, and words scrawled in languages I couldn't place. I traced one with my glove, the groove rough under my finger. Who had made these? Miners decades ago, or others who came after, drawn the same way I had been. The air shifted. It wasn't a gust, more like the breath of the earth itself. Cold swept across the chamber, carrying with it a susurrus of voices. My lantern flame guttered violently. I clamped my hands over my ears. The whispering wormed past anyway. Daniel, come down. The voices overlapped, male and female, old and young, coaxing. A shiver climbed my spine. I stumbled backward, but the ground felt less stable, as though the stone tilted toward the hole. I dropped one flashlight. It clattered, rolled, and vanished over the rim. Silence followed. Then a distant clink, like metal striking stone far below. And after that, faint, unmistakable laughter. I bolted. The fissure tore at my jacket as I forced through. My chalk marks blurred in the light as I raced along the tunnel. When I burst into the first chamber, I froze. Someone stood at the far wall. For a heartbeat, I thought it was another explorer, maybe a hiker who had followed me in. But the figure didn't move. It stood with its back turned, tall and thin, head tilted slightly as though listening to something in the stone. "Hey!" My voice cracked. The figure didn't turn. Lantern light reached just enough to catch the edges. Clothes gray with dust, hair matted, limbs wrong in proportion. The arms hung too long, fingers grazing the floor. Then it began to turn. Not in a natural swivel, but in a slow, deliberate twist, the body rotating without the legs moving. Its head pivoted last, face pale and eyeless, mouth curved in a smile too wide. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the lantern. The smile never shifted, but the jaw opened. wider and wider, until the skin split at the corners. From its throat came the same chorus of whispers I'd heard in the chamber, layered and endless. I didn't stay to see more. I sprinted through the tunnel, lantern banging against my thigh, breath tearing my chest. The entrance light grew until at last I burst into daylight, collapsing on the rocky slope. The shaft behind me stayed silent. The boards leaned unmoved. But when I staggered back down Cutter's Pass, legs trembling, I knew one truth. The rule wasn't just to keep people safe from collapse. It was to keep something inside. That night, I locked every door in the house and shoved a chair under the bedroom knob. My father noticed but said nothing. He only watched me with tired eyes, as though he'd known this would happen. Sleep didn't come. When I finally drifted, I dreamed of the figure again. Its arms dragging along stone, its mouth unhinged as it whispered my name. I woke to find dirt on the floor by the bed. Fine gray dust, like what coats the timbers deep in the mine. My boots stood by the door untouched. The next day I tried to tell myself I'd carried it in on my clothes. That explanation held until I came home from town to find new dust across the kitchen tiles in a trail leading to the back door. And when I opened that door, the wind outside whispered Daniel. I don't remember shutting it. I only remember sinking to the floor, shaking, clutching the letter. I can't throw it away. I can't stop hearing them. And worst of all, every night, the urge grows stronger, not just to go back, but to go down. I told myself I would not return. That vow lasted barely 2 days. The whispers never stopped. They slipped through the wind, through the walls of the house, even through the static of the old radio. At first I tried to drown them with noise, then with drink, then with exhaustion. None worked. The voices followed me into sleep, into waking, curling around my name like a lover's breath. Worse were the signs in the house. Dust where no dust should be. Footprints faint across the hallway carpet. Once, when I opened the bathroom mirror cabinet, I found a smear of wet stone across the glass, as though someone had pressed their cheek there and smiled. I stopped sleeping in my room. The chair jammed against the doorknob felt like a joke now. Instead, I dozed fitfully in the recliner beside my father, who hardly stirred anymore. His body grew thinner each day, his breath shallower, though his eyes stayed sharp. One evening, as the sun bled red over the ridges, he said without looking at me, "It has you, doesn't it?" I froze.
What? The mine.
His voice rasped. The mountain, same way it had your grandfather. You went in, and now it won't let go. I swallowed hard. What did he do? My father's eyes shifted toward me, pale and knowing. He went back, again and again, till one night he never came home. We told the sheriff he wandered off drunk. Truth is, I think he listened too close. The air thickened. Listened to what? My father's gaze returned to the window. You already know. That night the whispering grew clearer, layered yet distinct. Beneath the voices, I caught a rhythm, like words rising from a crowd. Over and over they called, "Come down. Come down." By morning I had stopped pretending. If I didn't return, I would rot above ground anyway, eaten hollow by the pull. Better to face what waited in the dark. I packed more carefully. Rope coiled tight, carabiners, fresh lantern fuel, backup flashlights, chalk water. At the last moment, I slipped my father's old revolver into the pack. He never asked why. He only watched me with the look of a man who'd already buried the outcome. The climb up Cutter's Pass felt like walking into a sentence already written. Clouds bruised the sky, wind pressing sharp against my back, as though urging me onward. The boards hung as before, useless guardians. I ducked under and lit the lantern. The first chamber greeted me with silence. Rubble sat unmoved, shadows deep in the corners. But as I turned toward the tunnel, I noticed something new carved into the nearest timber. fresh gouges, the wood pale where the knife had bitten. Ambiance. My stomach nodded. Someone, or something, expected me. The second chamber was colder than before, air damp and metallic. The fissure loomed at the far wall. I squeezed through, shoulders scraping stone, and stepped into the third chamber. The hole yawned at its center, black as memory. Around the rim, more symbols had appeared, scratched recent, lines still sharp. Spirals intersected, words etched in jagged hand W.E. White. The whispering began almost at once. My lantern flame shivered, bending toward the pit. The voices wove together, urgent, insistent. Daniel. Daniel, come down. I forced my breathing steady, dropped the coil of rope, and clipped it to a jag of rock near the fissure. Every nerve screamed against it, but my hands moved anyway, tying knots, checking the harness. My grandfather had taught me rope work when I was a boy. Maybe some part of me always knew this lesson would be used here. Lantern in one hand, revolver at my hip, I lowered myself over the rim. The descent swallowed light quickly. The shaft walls were unnaturally smooth, as if something had melted the rock long ago. Cold air pressed against me, whispering louder with each yard. My chalk marked the stone at intervals, though the rope itself was my only lifeline. Down I went, 20 feet, 40. My lantern's glow fell short, at 60. I thought I saw movement below, shadows twisting just out of range. At last my boots struck ground. The space at the bottom opened into a cavern vast and silent. The roof arched so high I could not see it. The walls gleamed faintly, veins of quartz glowing with the same bluish shimmer I'd glimpsed before. The floor was wrong. It wasn't stone alone. It shifted underfoot, gritty yet pliant, as though layers of dust and ash covered something softer. When I crouched, lantern close, I realized with a jolt that the pale flecks were not quartz at all. They were bones, tiny bones. Piles of them, scattered like sand. I straightened fast, heart hammering. The whispers pressed close, circling. From the far side of the cavern, figures began to emerge. At first they looked like miners. Helmets dented, lamps long dark. Clothes ragged with age. But as they drew nearer, their shapes stretched wrong. Arms too long, legs bent, crooked. Faces smeared blank except for mouths that split into endless smiles. The lantern flame wavered. My grip tightened on the revolver. They moved without sound, gliding across the bone-strewn floor. When they stopped a few feet away, the whispering rose in perfect unison. A tide of voices layered into one command: stay. I shook my head violently. No. The nearest figure tilted its head, smile widening until the jaw cracked. A low moan rose from its throat, echoing around the cavern. Others joined, weaving into the chorus until the air itself vibrated. Stay with us. Listen. I raised the revolver, hands trembling. Stay back. The lantern flame nearly died. Cold enveloped me, sinking into bone. Images hammered my skull. My grandfather walking willingly into the dark. My father staring hollow at the ridges, the mine boards sagging like broken teeth. The figures leaned closer. Their mouths moved in perfect rhythm. Though the words struck straight inside my head, we are the silence beneath. We are the hunger. You are ours. I pulled the trigger. The blast tore through the cavern, deafening. The nearest figure collapsed into dust and ash, scattering like smoke. For one breath I thought it might work. Then the rest surged forward. I ran, lantern swinging wildly. Revolver hot in my hand, I sprinted across the cavern toward where the wall dipped into another tunnel. Bones crunched underfoot. The whispering rose into a howl. The tunnel narrowed, jagged stone scraping my shoulders. I fired twice more without looking back. The echoes thundered, but the voices never faltered. At last the passage spat me into another chamber, smaller, low, ceilinged, walls slick with damp. My lantern flickered, nearly out of fuel. I pressed against the rock, gasping, revolver shaking in my grip. The whispering dimmed. For a moment I thought I had lost them. Then a new sound drifted through the tunnel behind me. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, dragging. I staggered forward, deeper into the chamber, lantern light sliding over the walls. More markings scarred the stone, carved with fury. Doen, Telusten, Leisten. The footsteps grew louder. I spun. In the tunnel mouth stood a single figure, taller than the rest, shoulders brushing the ceiling. Its head bent crooked, face pale and eyeless, mouth stretched into a rictus grin. In its hand it held my dropped flashlight, beam flicking across the walls. It raised the light toward me like an offering. "Daniel," it whispered, not with many voices, but with one. A voice I knew. My grandfather's. The lantern slipped in my grip. "Come home," the voice crooned. "It's been waiting for you." I staggered back, revolver raised, though my arms felt like lead. The figure stepped forward, dragging the flashlight across the floor. Behind it, shadows wreathed like smoke. The walls pressed close. My lungs seized. And then, faint, almost lost, I heard another voice. My father's. Weak, raspy, carried through memory. "You'll do well not to listen." The spell cracked. I hurled the lantern at the figure. Glass shattered, flame erupting. The creature recoiled, shrieking in a chorus of voices. Fire leapt across the damp walls, smoke filling the chamber. I turned and ran. Through the tunnel, back across the cavern, bones crunching, whispers shrieking. I scrambled to the rope, fumbling knots with shaking hands, and clawed my way upward. The figures surged below, mouths open in endless smiles, but none climbed. They only raised their arms, reaching, whispering, until the cavern shrank into darkness. At last my hands caught the rim. I hauled myself into the third chamber, lungs burning. The rope swung wildly behind me. The fissure loomed ahead. I stumbled through, scraping stone, sprinted past the second chamber, past the rubble in the first, until daylight finally seared my eyes. I collapsed outside, coughing smoke, skin frozen despite the sun. Behind me, the shaft lay silent. The boards leaned as before, wire dangling loose. No sign of fire, no smell of smoke. Only the desert wind whispering through sagebrush. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew the mine wasn't done with me. I didn't go home right away. My legs carried me down Cutter's Pass, but when the truck came into view, I froze. The mine loomed behind me, silent, patient. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that, if I turned the key and drove off, I would find something waiting in my house. So I sat in the cab until the sun went down, trembling hands locked around the wheel, eyes on the trailhead. When the sky darkened and the wind rose, I finally started the engine and drove into town. The house was dark. My father slept in his recliner, his chest rising shallow. For a moment I thought about shaking him awake, telling him everything. The cavern, the figures, the voice that wore my grandfather's tongue. But what good would it do? He already knew enough, maybe too much. I washed my hands 3 times, but the smell of smoke and stone clung stubbornly. Dust streaked my clothes, grit under my nails. When I collapsed on the couch, I left the lamp burning. Sleep came in broken waves. At some point in the night, I woke to the sound of footsteps across the kitchen tile. Slow, deliberate, dragging. I didn't move. My pulse hammered so loudly I thought it might shake the walls. The steps drew closer, reached the living room doorway, then stopped. The lamp buzzed faintly. Shadows clung heavy at the edges of the room. I forced my eyes toward the doorway. Nothing stood there. Only the empty hall, dark and still. But on the floor, faint and gray, were footprints. Long, narrow, pressed into the dust. I didn't sleep again. By morning, my father's health had worsened. He sat with his eyes half shut, lips whispering words I couldn't catch. When I leaned closer, I realized he was repeating the same phrase over and over. "Don't listen, don't listen, don't listen." I gripped his frail hand. "I went down there," I admitted softly. "I saw them. I saw him. For the first time in days, his gaze sharpened. You shouldn't have. I know, but they're here now. They followed me out. He shook his head weakly. They were always here. The mind just shows them to you. His words sank like lead. Always here. That night, the dream returned. I stood in the cavern again, bones shifting under my boots. The figures circled, whispering in unison, but one stepped forward. The tall one, mouth split wide. My grandfather's voice rolled out of the dark jaw. Stay. Stay with us. It's easier down here. No pain, no hunger, only silence. When I woke, tears slicked my face. For a brief, dangerous moment, I wanted to believe him. The days blurred. I stopped going to town, stopped answering calls. My world shrank to the house, the road to Cutter's Pass, and the weight of the voices. Every time the wind rose, I heard them clearer. They called not just from the mine, but from cracks in the sidewalk, from drains, from the hollow spaces in walls. And the footprints kept appearing across the hall, at the base of the stairs. Once, right beside my bed when I woke at dawn. Always thin, always dusted gray. On the 5th night after the descent, I found my father sitting upright, eyes wide. His voice rasped from a throat dry as stone. They'll want you back, he whispered. They never let go. Then how do I stop it? My voice cracked. His gaze lingered on me, pity and fear mingled. You don't. You can only choose when. Before I could press him, his eyes fluttered shut, and his breathing slipped shallow again. I sat beside him until morning. The pressure built until I couldn't bear it. I told myself I'd go back once more, not to stay, but to end it. Maybe I could burn what waited inside, collapse the shaft, sever the connection. The thought gave me focus, though I'm not sure if it was resolve or madness. I gathered supplies, fuel cans, matches, rope. The revolver stayed at my side. When I reached Cutter's Pass, the sky churned low and gray, clouds swallowing the ridges. The air smelled sharp, metallic. The shaft weighted, boards leaning, wire swaying, inside. The tunnels welcomed me like old lungs drawing breath. My chalk marks still clung to the stone. The first chamber was silent. The second reeked of damp earth. The fissure yawned. I squeezed through, lantern swinging, and stepped into the third chamber. The hole breathed cold. The markings had multiplied again, carved in fresh gouges across the stone. One phrase repeated in jagged hand, "Stay Deutsch US." I dropped the rope, secured the anchor, and began the descent. The whispers rose at once, layered and relentless. Daniel, Daniel, Daniel. My boots struck bone again. The cavern spread vast and waiting. Shadows shifted at the edges, mouths grinning. I unslung the fuel can, sloshed it across the floor. The reek of gasoline cut through the cold. I emptied another near the walls, splashing the symbols, the bones, the rock. The whispering surged into a howl. Figures pressed closer, their smiles straining wide. No fire here, no flame, only silence. I struck a match. For a moment the cavern flared gold. Fire leapt across bones, smoke rising sharp. Figures shrieked in chorus, voices splintering into static. The quartz veins glowed brighter, the walls trembling. But the flames didn't spread. They burned only where the fuel splashed, thin and weak. The bones blackened, cracked, but the shadows remained unshaken. The tall figure stepped forward through the smoke. My grandfather's voice rolled like thunder. You can't burn silence. You can't kill hunger. You can only join it. The match burned to my fingers. I dropped it, clutching the revolver. Then I'll kill you. I fired. The bullet tore through its chest, scattering dust and smoke. But the figure did not fall. Its smile widened, splitting ear to ear. You already belong. Behind it, the other figures raised their arms. From their mouths, the whispering swelled into a roar. Sty. Sty. The floor trembled. Bones shifted, rolling like waves. The cavern pulsed with blue light, veins glowing brighter until the whole chamber seemed alive. I staggered backward, firing blindly. Dust filled the air, choking, blinding. My rope swung above, the only lifeline. I turned and ran, boots slipping across shifting bones. The cavern howled behind me, the voices chasing into my skull. I scrambled up the rope, lungs burning, arms screaming. When I dragged myself over the rim into the third chamber, the pit glowed like an open wound. Whispers surged upward, pressing against my skull. I tore through the fissure, stumbled past the second chamber, then the first, until daylight seared my eyes. Outside, the sky was split by storm clouds, wind shrieking through the pass. The earth beneath my boots shuddered. Behind me, a deep groan rolled from the mine, as though the mountain itself was breathing. I stumbled to the truck, slammed the door, and sat shaking. My ears still rang with whispers. The shaft hadn't burned. The fire hadn't worked. And worst of all, I knew the cavern would never forget me now. At night, as I sat in the silent house, my father stirred. His voice rasped, weak but clear. "You went back." I couldn't answer. His eyes opened, bright with fever. "You hear them still?" "Yes," I whispered. "Everywhere." He nodded, almost sadly. "Then it's too late." "Too late for what?" His breath rattled. "Too late to come back up." I gripped his hand. "I'm not going down again. I won't." His gaze drifted past me, toward the window where the desert night pressed close. "You already are." I turned, heart hammering. In the reflection on the glass, I saw them, thin gray figures, smiling mouths wide. Standing behind me, when I spun, the room was empty, only my father, wheezing softly. But the dust on the floor told the truth. Footprints trailed from the door to my chair. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. The whispers seep into everything, every silence filled with their voices. The footprints appear each night, closer, clearer. I used to think the rule, stay out, was about safety, about preventing accidents. Now I know it was a warning far older. And I fear I've already broken it beyond repair. I thought the mine was behind me. I thought that if I stayed in the house, locked every door, ignored the wind, I could outlast it. I was wrong. The whispers grew sharper each night, less like background noise, more like direct voices pressed to my ear. I no longer heard them outside. I heard them in my blood, threading through each pulse. They no longer coaxed, they commanded. "Come down." My father knew. His eyes dimmed more each day, his body shrinking into the recliner. But when I caught him awake, he would rasp the same words. "Don't listen. Don't listen." As if he could shield me by repeating it. It wasn't enough. The 7th night after my last descent, I woke standing at the front door, hand on the knob, dust under my bare feet. I hadn't remembered leaving bed. The desert wind pressed against the siding, whispering my name. I slammed the lock and stumbled back, hard a hammer. By morning, I knew it would only get worse. I sat across from my father, voice breaking. They won't stop. His eyes, foggy and weak, fixed on mine. They never do. What if I go down again? What if I face them, finish it somehow? His breath rattled. You can't finish hunger. You can only feed it or starve it. I gripped his hand. Then I'll starve it. But even as I said it, I knew starvation wasn't an option. Hunger waits. Hunger grows. That night, the dust footprints reached my bed again. I woke to find them pressed into the sheets beside me, indentations as though someone had lain there. My skin crawled. My resolve broke. I would go back, not to fight, not to burn, but to end it, one way or another. The storm had passed by morning. The desert lay under a low, gray sky, clouds heavy, air cold. I packed rope, lantern, revolver, and a single can of fuel. Enough for a last strike or a last light. When I left, my father's eyes followed me. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The trail up Cutter's Pass felt shorter than ever, as though the mountain drew me in. My legs hardly strained, my breath never faltered. The shaft waited, boards leaning, wire dangling, like a mouth already open. Inside, the air pressed damp and metallic. My chalk marks still lined the walls, though some looked smeared, as if fingers had dragged across them. The first chamber held only silence. The second reeked of damp stone. The fissure swallowed me without pause. In the third chamber, the hole glowed faint blue, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. The markings around the rim had multiplied again, gouged deeper, spirals and words overlapping. I tied the rope. My hands didn't shake. Down I went. The cavern welcomed me with a roar of whispers. Figures stirred at the edges, dozens now, their mouths stretching wider, smiles splitting skin. Bones shifted underfoot like sand. At the far end, the tall figure waited. Shoulders bent, head cocked, grin endless. My grandfather's voice rolled out of it, low and resonant. "Welcome home." I lifted the lantern. The flame barely held against the cold. "Why me?" The chorus answered at once, 1,000 voices layered. "Because you listen." I staggered forward, bones crunching. "What are you?" The voices swelled. "We are silence. We are what the earth keeps. We are the weight beneath your feet. We are what waits when light dies." The tall figure stepped closer, dust trailing from its limbs. "You can't leave. You're already part of us." The whispers slid into my skull, images hammering. My grandfather's descent, my father staring hollow at the mountains, myself lying in the dust beside the pit. I saw my own body, gray and smiling, rising to join them. For one breath, I wanted it. The silence promised an end to hunger, an end to pain. No more struggle, no more fear. Only quiet, endless and deep. But then I saw my father again, frail and whispering, clinging to life in a broken chair, still resisting. "Don't listen." The flame in the lantern wavered. I pulled the revolver free. The tall figure spread its arms. "You can't kill silence." "Maybe not," I said, voice cracking. "But I can kill myself before you take me." For the first time, the smile faltered. The whispers surged. "No, no, no." I raised the revolver to my head. My finger tightened. The cavern shook. The whispers screamed. The tall figure lunged. I fired. The shot split the roar, deafening. Pain blossomed across my temple, fire flooding my skull. For a moment, the world fractured. Blue light, white fire, black silence. And then, I woke in the dirt outside the shaft. The sun glared overhead, harsh and hot. My head throbbed, blood sticky at my temple, but I was alive. The revolver lay empty beside me, the rope frayed and cut. The shaft behind me was silent, no glow rose, no whispers pressed. Only wind through sagebrush dry and thin. I stumbled down Cutter's Pass, vision blurred, ears ringing. My legs carried me without thought. When I reached the house, my father still sat in his recliner, eyes half shut. He opened them as I staggered in. For a moment, he looked surprised. Then his mouth curved in something almost like relief. "You came back," he whispered. "I'm here," I rasped. He nodded once, eyes closing again. "Then maybe it isn't forever." I collapsed beside him, revolver slipping from my hand. That was 3 weeks ago. The whispers have not returned. The footprints have faded. At night, the wind rattles only like wind. The house is quiet, the desert ordinary. But sometimes, in the stillest hours, I catch the faintest sound beneath it all. A murmur, a sigh, rising from the earth. I don't listen. I don't answer. And yet, when I close my eyes, I see the cavern. I see the tall figure, arms open, smile endless. I hear my grandfather's voice, low and patient. We wait. The rule was simple, stay out. I broke it. And though I walked back into daylight, I don't know if I ever truly left. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I was never the kind of man who put much stock in ghost stories. I grew up in a small town in rural Virginia, where every back road and every mountain hollow had some tale of witches or spirits tied to it. Most of the people I knew seemed to relish telling those stories, as if sharing them somehow gave a sense of ownership over the fear that ran through them. I was different. I believed in what I could touch, in what I could see with my own eyes. Anything else I chalked up to imagination, exaggeration, or superstition passed down so many times that the details had warped into something unrecognizable. I tell you this not to convince you of my rationality, but to emphasize the weight of what happened to me and why I will never again dismiss the stories people share about places that carry darkness. The cabin in question was nothing more than a crude hunting shack tucked deep into the Blue Ridge Mountains. It belonged to a family friend, though I had never seen it before that night. Its reputation, however, I had heard whispered since I was a boy. People said strange things happened there. Objects moving, footsteps in empty rooms, voices murmuring through thin walls. Hunters who stayed overnight claimed they never returned to the place again, and locals swore the land itself resisted being settled. I had always rolled my eyes at these accounts. A drafty old shack with creaking boards could explain footsteps. Wind whistling through gaps in the timber could sound like voices. Fear was a powerful thing, and when you slept in the woods, every sound grew teeth. But life has a way of testing disbelief. One autumn evening, after my truck broke down on a remote road, and the sun began its swift descent behind the ridges, I found myself without options. I had been on my way to visit my cousin in a neighboring county, planning to spend the weekend hiking and catching up. When the engine gave out, the cell signal was long gone, and I was left staring at the miles of shadowy forest around me. I knew the cabin was close. A man named Harold, who used to hunt with my father, had mentioned it was less than 2 miles off the road where my truck sputtered to its death. With darkness closing in and no chance of help until morning, I had a choice: spend the night in the open or take my chances with the cabin. The air had that sharp October bite, heavy with the scent of fallen leaves beginning to rot. Coyotes yipped in the distance, and the forest seemed to grow thicker as night crept in. I shouldered my pack, locked the truck as though that would matter, and followed the barely visible trail into the woods. Every step carried me deeper into silence broken only by my breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. My flashlight beam wavered across tree trunks, catching glimpses of twisted branches and the glint of animal eyes retreating into darkness. I tried not to think about the stories I had heard. When the cabin finally appeared, it did so suddenly, as though the trees had been holding it back until the last possible second. It was small, no more than one room with a slanted roof, its weathered boards silvered with age. The windows were black and uninviting, and the door leaned slightly off its hinges. I paused at the edge of the clearing, the beam of my flashlight resting on the structure, and for the first time that evening, unease took root in my chest. It looked less like a place built for shelter and more like something abandoned by the living, left as a marker of something that had passed long ago. Still, the cold and fatigue pushed me forward. The door groaned when I pressed it open, the sound echoing into the hollow room. Dust drifted in the beam of my light, and the smell was one of mildew old smoke and something faintly metallic. Inside, there was a cot pushed against the far wall, a small iron stove with a cracked pipe, and a table scarred by years of use. Someone had left behind a rusted lantern, though I had no oil to feed it. The place was bare, but it would do. I set my pack down on the table, forcing myself to focus on the practical, unroll my sleeping bag, check for leaks in the roof, make sure the door could close against the night. It was only after I settled in that the quiet pressed itself against me in a way that felt unnatural. The woods, so full of sound during my walk, now seemed utterly still. No wind stirred the trees. No insects hummed. It was as though the forest itself held its breath around the cabin. I told myself it was just my imagination, the exhaustion of the long day and the disorientation of being somewhere unfamiliar. I had a tendency to overthink when I was tired. That was all. I lay back on the cot, my hands folded over my chest, staring at the shadows the flashlight threw against the ceiling. The boards creaked occasionally as the structure settled, and I tried to focus on those sounds, grounding myself in what was real. Yet beneath the creaks, I began to notice something else. At first it was faint, like the memory of a sound, the way you sometimes think you hear your name in a crowd. Then it grew clearer, a slow, steady rhythm, like footsteps pacing just outside the cabin. I froze. My first thought was that another traveler had stumbled upon the place, maybe another stranded soul looking for shelter. But the footsteps didn't approach the door. They circled the cabin, crunching through the leaves, dragging slightly as though the walker's feet were heavy. Around and around they went, never pausing, never retreating. My pulse thudded in my ears, and I forced myself to sit up, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. "Hello." My voice cracked in the silence. "There's someone out there." The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise. I waited, my breath shallow, my eyes fixed on the door. Then, slowly, the footsteps resumed, but this time they were inside. I swept the flashlight across the room, the beam darting from wall to wall. Nothing. The cot, the table, the stove, empty. Yet the sound was unmistakable, pressing into the floorboards as though someone were walking just beyond the reach of the light. I stood, the beam trembling in my hand, and the footsteps stopped again. I told myself I was overtired, that the sound was the cabin settling in the cool night air. But even as I tried to reason it away, I felt the undeniable weight of being watched. The air was thicker now, harder to draw into my lungs. My skin prickled as though unseen eyes lingered on every movement. For the next hour, I sat on the cot, flashlight pointed toward the center of the room, refusing to blink. Every creak set my nerves on edge. At some point, exhaustion began to override fear, and my eyelids drooped despite the adrenaline coursing through me. I told myself I would just close my eyes for a moment, just long enough to steady myself. When I woke, the flashlight had died, leaving me in complete darkness. My heart slammed against my ribs as I fumbled for my pack, digging out fresh batteries with shaking hands. The silence was absolute, suffocating. Then, as the light flickered back to life, I saw the door was open. I was certain I had shut it. Positive. Now it gaped into the night, the clearing beyond swallowed by shadows. Cold air poured inside, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something acrid that caught in the back of my throat. I forced myself to stand, to walk to the door and push it closed again, the hinges screaming in protest. My hand lingered on the latch, as though expecting it to resist. When it clicked into place, I stepped back, my entire body trembling. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat with my back against the wall, flashlight in one hand, a pocket knife in the other, straining to hear any sound. The night stretched on endlessly, every minute a lifetime. At some point, I realized the pacing footsteps had returned, but this time they weren't circling outside. They were directly above me, moving back and forth across the roof. The cabin had no second floor. I cannot fully explain the dread that consumed me in that moment. It was not the kind of fear that makes you run. It was the kind that freezes you in place, that convinces you even breathing too loudly will draw attention you cannot survive. I pressed my back harder against the wall, staring upward as though the weight of my gaze could keep whatever it was from breaking through the boards. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, methodical and unhurried. Then, without warning, they stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I strained to hear, to know where it had gone, but there was nothing. And then, from the corner of the room, came the sound of breathing. It was slow, ragged, and so close I swore I could feel the exhale brush my skin. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, the beam slicing through empty air, illuminating only dust motes drifting lazily. Yet the breathing remained, moving slightly, as though circling me in the dark. My resolve broke. I shouted, my voice hoarse, demanding that whatever was there show itself. The breathing stopped, cut off as though a hand had smothered it. For several long minutes, the cabin was silent again, and I almost convinced myself it had gone. Then, slowly, the door creaked open once more, inch by inch, though I had latched it firmly. This time, I didn't move to close it. I couldn't. My body refused to obey. I sat frozen, watching as the door swung wider, the darkness outside spilling in like ink. The forest remained utterly still, no wind, no sound, only that gaping blackness waiting just beyond the threshold. I do not remember when or how the night finally ended. At some point, exhaustion must have dragged me into unconsciousness despite the terror. When the first light of dawn filtered through the cracked windows, I awoke slumped against the wall, the flashlight still clutched in my stiff fingers. The door was closed again. Relief surged through me, but it was short-lived. Scratched into the wood of the table, deep and fresh, were words that had not been there before. LEAV, morning light should have brought relief, but it only made the room look worse. The pale gray beams creeping through the cracked boards exposed how filthy the place really was. Mildew spreading in dark blooms across the walls, cobwebs thick in every corner, and the floor warped with age. My eyes returned again and again to the word gouged into the table, LEV. The letters were jagged raw, as if carved in haste by something that didn't care about neatness, only about the urgency of the message. For several minutes, I stared at it, waiting for some trick of light to reveal that had always been there and I had simply missed it. The grooves were sharp and fresh, the wood pale where it had been cut, untouched by dust. I touched one of the letters with my fingertip. The edges were rough, splintering into my skin. This wasn't old. This had been made during the night, sometime after I had closed my eyes. I packed quickly, throwing my sleeping bag into my pack without bothering to roll it. My only thought was to get out, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this cabin. But when I reached for the door, my chest tightened. The latch lifted easily, the hinges groaned, and the door swung open. The clearing lay before me, damp with morning mist. Yet as I stepped toward it, something made me hesitate. The forest did not look right. The trees leaned in strange ways, their trunks twisted as though they had grown in pain. The mist curled low to the ground, thick enough to obscure the path, and in the silence I could hear what I swore was faint whispering. Just out of range, but enough to prickle the back of my neck. I stepped back inside and slammed the door shut. My rational mind screamed that I was being foolish, that mist and silence were nothing unusual in mountain woods, that I was inventing threats because of exhaustion. Yet every instinct in me warned that stepping into that fog would be a mistake. So I waited. I sat on the edge of the cot, breathing hard, watching the door as though something might push it open again. Time moved strangely. Minutes felt like hours. The daylight shifted from gray to pale gold, but the mist outside did not lift. Hunger gnawed at me, but the thought of eating in that cabin, of doing anything so normal, while the carved word burned into my mind, turned my stomach. By noon, I could no longer stand the waiting. I slung my pack over my shoulder, tightened my grip on the flashlight though the sun was high, and opened the door again. The mist still hung thick, curling in the clearing like smoke. I forced myself forward, one step, then another, until I was swallowed by it. The trail should have been easy to find. I had followed it just the night before. But as I pushed through the fog, the woods twisted into unfamiliar shapes. The trees grew closer together, their bark slick with moisture. I walked for what felt like an hour, turning in circles, trying to orient myself by the slope of the ground or the angle of the sun, but nothing made sense. Every direction looked the same. Every sound I made seemed swallowed by the mist, as if the forest itself refused to acknowledge my presence. Panic rose quickly. My chest tightened. My legs ached from stumbling over roots hidden in the fog, and my breath came in ragged bursts. I called out once, just to hear a human voice, but the sound echoed back strangely distorted, as though someone else had spoken my words in mockery. That was the moment I knew I couldn't keep wandering. I had no choice but to return to the cabin. Finding it again should have been impossible, but within minutes, the clearing opened before me. The cabin loomed just as it had before, squat and unwelcoming, its boards gray against the pale mist. Relief should have come. Instead, dread settled deeper in my gut. The place hadn't let me go. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been. I dropped my pack and leaned against the wall, sweat cooling on my skin, trying to slow my breathing. The carved word on the table seemed deeper now, as though the grooves had widened on their own. I turned away from it, refusing to look. That afternoon stretched endlessly. I paced the small room, sat on the cot, stood at the window staring into the shifting fog. At times I thought I saw shapes moving within it. Tall, thin figures that lingered just beyond clarity. When I blinked, they were gone. When I pressed my ear to the wall, I thought I could hear them whispering, a faint susurrus that never resolved into words. As the sun dipped low again, fear became something heavier, almost physical. My body ached with it, my stomach churned. I considered trying again to leave, but I knew somehow it wouldn't matter. The forest had bent itself around me, and the cabin would not release me. The best I could do was survive the night. Darkness fell faster than it should have. One moment the clearing glowed with the last light of day. The next it was swallowed by shadow. I fumbled with the flashlight, my hands shaking as I switched it on, the beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the gloom. That was when the knocking began. At first it was soft, a single rap against the wall near the stove, then another closer to the window, then another right by the door, each knock distinct, measured, as though whatever was outside was circling again, testing the boundaries of the cabin. My breath hitched. The sound continued, moving from one side of the shack to the other, methodical and deliberate. I shouted again, though I don't remember what I said. Something about leaving me alone, about not being afraid. The words felt hollow, brittle as the boards surrounding me. The knocking paused, and for a heartbeat the silence returned. Then came the scratching. It started at the door, long, slow drags of something sharp across the wood. The sound crawled down my spine, setting every nerve on edge. The scratches moved higher, then lower, as if claws were testing the door's strength. My light shook wildly as I pointed it toward the sound, but the door remained still. When I reached out to touch it, the scratching stopped. That was when I realized it wasn't only the door. The sound came from the walls too, faint at first, then growing louder. All around me, invisible claws raked against the boards, enclosing me in a cocoon of noise. The air vibrated with it, a maddening chorus that built until I clapped my hands over my ears. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. My own heartbeat sounded deafening. From the corner of the room came the whispering again. This time it was louder, more distinct, though still impossible to make out. I turned the flashlight toward the sound. Dust motes danced in the beam, but the corner was empty. Still, the whispering grew, layering upon itself until it seemed dozens of voices pressed against my skull. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, rocking back and forth with the light clutched to my chest. "Stop," I begged, though I knew they wouldn't. The voices fell silent only when the temperature plummeted. My breath clouded before me, frost gathering on the edge of the table, where the word Liev seemed to glow faintly in the beam of the light. And then, as if mocking me, a new word carved itself into the wood right before my eyes. Stai. The letters cut themselves deep into the surface with a sound like tearing flesh. Though no hand or tool moved across it, I watched, paralyzed, as the grooves deepened and widened, flakes of wood scattering onto the floor. When it was finished, the word sat beneath the first, contradicting it, trapping me between commands. I cannot explain the despair that settled over me then. To leave was impossible. To stay was unbearable. I was caught in something far older and crueler than I could understand, something that fed on fear and confusion. The night stretched on, a blur of sound and silence, whispers and scratching. At times I thought I heard laughter, high and thin, like children playing in the distance. At others, I swore I saw shadows shifting across the floor, though nothing blocked the beam of my light. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. My body refused rest, every muscle locked in terror. When dawn came again, it was weak, gray, and offered no comfort. The mist still clung to the clearing. My hands shook violently as I tried to eat a granola bar from my pack, but the taste turned to ash in my mouth. I spat it out, my stomach heaving. I thought of smashing the table, destroying the words carved into it, but something stopped me. The idea filled me with a dread deeper than anything I had felt before, as if breaking the table would unleash something worse. So I left it untouched. The twin commands burned into my vision. By mid-morning, exhaustion overcame me. My eyelids drooped despite my efforts, and I drifted into a restless half-sleep on the cot. Dreams, or something like them, came quickly. In them, I saw the forest alive with figures, tall and skeletal, their faces hidden in shadow. They moved silently through the trees, circling the cabin, always circling. One of them stepped closer, its hand stretching toward me, fingers impossibly long. When they brushed my chest, I jolted awake, gasping, my shirt damp with sweat. The cabin was silent again, but I knew I wasn't alone. The air felt occupied, heavy with presence. I sat there for hours, listening, waiting, caught between the urge to run and the certainty that running would only lead me back to the same place. As the second night approached, I realized something terrible. The cabin wasn't just haunted, it was alive. Alive. That word would not leave me. The cabin breathed in its own way. The walls shifted as though listening. The floor vibrated faintly beneath my boots when I paced, not from my weight, but from something deeper, as if the earth itself pulsed upward through the timbers. By evening, I stopped trying to deny it. Every rational explanation I had clung to in the first 24 hours had slipped away. Whatever this place was, it was not inert. It was aware. The second sunset bled through the mist in sickly hues, orange fading into bruised purple, before darkness swallowed everything. I lit the flashlight again and placed it on the table so its beam washed across the far wall, though the glow only emphasized the carved words. Liev above, Stala below. They seemed to throb faintly, as if reacting to the light. My skin crawled every time my eyes returned to them, so I forced myself to look anywhere else. The cabin smelled different now. Less of mildew and dust, more of something sore, metallic, faintly sweet in a rotting way. It reminded me of a slaughterhouse I had walked past once as a teenager, where the air carried both blood and decay. The odor clung to my throat, making every breath thick and heavy. I tried again to eat but couldn't force food down. My body trembled with fatigue, but fear kept me alert, twitching at every sound. The scratching began earlier this night, before the sun had even fully set. At first soft, tentative, as if testing whether I would respond. Then louder, faster, until it sounded like dozens of claws raking the cabin all at once. I covered my ears, but it was useless. The noise seemed to come from inside my skull. I shouted again, not with bravado this time, but desperation. "What do you want from me?" My voice cracked, breaking under the weight of terror. The scratching stopped instantly. The silence that followed pressed down on me like a physical weight. And then, from directly behind me, came the answer. A whisper. One word, drawn out in a voice dry and brittle as leaves. "You." I spun, the flashlight beam cutting across the cabin, but the space was empty. My pulse hammered so hard I could barely see. The single word echoed in my mind until it wasn't just memory. It was repetition, dozens of voices overlapping, hissing the same word from every shadow. "You, you, you." My legs gave out and I sank to the floor, pressing my back to the cot. The light shook wildly in my hand, darting across the room. For a moment, the beam landed on something in the corner near the stove. Something tall and thin, leaning forward as though stepping out of the darkness. I blinked and it was gone, but the impression of it seared itself into my vision. Limbs too long, shoulders hunched, a head that tilted unnaturally to the side. The whispers subsided, replaced by a low moan that seemed to seep from the very walls. The floorboards vibrated under me, and the table rattled against the uneven ground. The carved words appeared deeper still, the grooves dark as if filled with blood. I couldn't tear my eyes away. Suddenly the flashlight went out. Darkness swallowed everything, thicker than any night I had known. My shaking fingers fumbled with the batteries, but before I could replace them, the room changed. I didn't see it. I felt it. The air shifted, heavy with presence. The breathing returned slow and ragged, moving around me in the dark. I squeezed my eyes shut, but that only made it worse. With sight gone, every other sense sharpened. The floor creaked beside me, boards groaning under weight. The sound of knuckles, or claws, dragged across the cot fabric inches from my shoulder. I could smell the stench of decay more strongly now, as though something stood directly over me. I forced the flashlight on, its beam flickering before it steadied. Nothing. The room was empty, but the cot bore marks now. Thin slashes across the fabric, fresh and raw. My chest seized, breath coming in panicked gasps. I backed into the far corner, light fixed on the cot, unwilling to let the shadows reclaim it. The hours crawled. Time lost meaning. At moments I swore the walls moved closer, the cabin shrinking around me. At others, the ceiling seemed to stretch upward, vanishing into blackness no light could pierce. My sanity frayed at the edges, held together only by the trembling beam of my flashlight. Then, sometime past midnight, the door opened. It didn't creak this time. It swung wide in silence, revealing the clearing beyond, but the clearing wasn't as I remembered. The mist was gone. In its place stretched a forest I had never seen before. The trees were skeletal, branches stripped bare, bark pale as bone. The sky above them glowed a sickly green, no moon, no stars. I stared, transfixed. The beam of my flashlight lost against that alien light, and standing just beyond the threshold was the figure. Tall and possibly thin, its limbs crooked at unnatural angles. Its head tilted as though its neck couldn't support the weight. The face, if it had one, was shadowed, features shifting when I tried to focus. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there watching. My body refused to obey when my mind screamed to slam the door. I was caught paralyzed, heart hammering. Finally, with a burst of desperate will, I lunged forward and shoved the door shut. The latch clicked into place, and I stumbled back, gasping. But even with the door closed, the air inside remained wrong, colder, heavier, filled with the sense that the figure hadn't been kept out at all. I whispered to myself, over and over, "It isn't real. It isn't real." But I knew better. The whispers returned, closer now, directly in my ears, though no mouth spoke them. They carried fragments of sentences I couldn't piece together, words twisted and layered. But one phrase cut through clearly: "You belong." The floor shook violently then, the table crashing onto its side, splinters flying. The cot slid across the room as though shoved by unseen hands. My pack burst open, contents spilling, scattering as if some wild wind had swept through, though the air was still. The flashlight beam wavered as the entire cabin seemed to convulse, boards groaning and cracking. I thought the place would collapse. Then everything stopped. I stood alone in the center of the cabin, my belongings strewn across the floor, the table overturned, the cot ruined. The silence pressed in, thicker than before. My breathing sounded too loud, obscene in the hush. And then I saw them. In the far corner, where shadow clung deepest, stood not one figure but many. Tall, thin shapes, their outlines flickering as though not fully solid. They didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood shoulder to shoulder, faces lost in darkness. My throat closed. I tried to raise the flashlight higher, but my arm shook too violently. The beam caught glimpses, elongated fingers, hollow sockets where eyes should be, mouths stretched wide in soundless screams. I stumbled back, my heel catching on my spilled gear, and fell hard against the floor. The light tumbled from my grasp, rolling until it pointed upward, casting the ceiling in a cone of trembling brightness. The figures remained in shadow, untouched by the beam, as though the light refused to touch them. I crawled backward until my spine hit the wall. The figures remained still, but the whispering grew louder, rising into a chorus that filled every inch of the room. Words overlapped, fragments bleeding into one another, until they became meaningless noise. I pressed my palms to my ears, but the sound vibrated through my bones. My vision blurred, tears streaming. I shouted, screamed, begged them to stop. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The corner stood empty, the whispers cut off mid-syllable. Only silence remained. My chest heaved, lungs burning as though I had run for miles. My eyes darted across the room, desperate to catch any movement, but there was nothing. The cabin looked almost normal again, though destroyed by the chaos of moments before. But I was not normal. Something inside me had broken. I could feel it. A fracture in the part of me that believed in safety, in reason, in the stability of the world. That fracture widened with each passing second, and I knew no matter what happened next, I would never be the same. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the corner, flashlight in hand, whispering prayers I hadn't spoken since childhood. My voice shook, but I clung to each word like a lifeline. The cabin listened. I could feel it. The boards beneath me seemed to pulse faintly in rhythm with my words, as though mocking or echoing them. When dawn finally came, pale and weak through the slats, I didn't move. My body ached from stillness, my throat raw from whispered pleas, but I stayed frozen. I expected relief, sunlight burning away shadows, but the day brought no comfort. The mist had returned outside, thicker than ever, and etched into the wall now, just above where I sat, were new words: far, var. I stared at them until my vision blurred, until I wondered if I had carved them myself, in some fugue of madness. But the grooves were too deep, too deliberate. I reached out with trembling fingers and traced the letters, feeling the rough edges, the fresh splinters. No, it wasn't my hand that had done this. It was the cabin. Something inside me cracked further then, not just fear but despair. I realized I might never leave this place. The cabin didn't just want me for the night. It wanted me completely. The word Fa'arvar burned itself into my mind long after my fingers left the grooves. I sat there with my back to the wall, numb, unable to decide whether to laugh or scream. The cabin had made its intention clear. Whatever was here wasn't satisfied with tormenting me through the night. It wanted permanence. But even as despair coiled around me, another thought pressed in harder. If I stayed, I would be consumed. I could already feel pieces of myself slipping away. My hunger was gone, my sense of time shredded, my thoughts looping endlessly. I was unraveling. If I didn't try again to escape, soon there might be nothing left of me to even attempt it. By mid-morning, I forced myself to gather what little remained of my strength. My pack was torn, but I stuffed what I could inside. Water bottle, spare batteries. The flashlight, though it flickered, my knife. I left the rest. The carved words glared at me from the walls and table, but I refused to look at them again. If the cabin wanted to keep me, it would have to chase me. When I opened the door, the mist hit me like a solid wall. It curled into the cabin, cold and damp, clinging to my skin. My breath came in sharp bursts, but I stepped forward anyway. The clearing disappeared after only a few paces, swallowed in the thick, gray haze. I told myself I wouldn't stop moving until I found the road. I repeated it like a mantra: don't stop, don't look back, don't listen. The mist distorted everything. Shapes loomed where there should have been trees, twisting into angles that made no sense. My footsteps sounded muted, muffled as if I walked through cloth. At times I thought I heard rushing water, though no streams ran near the cabin. Other times I swore I heard my own voice calling from ahead, begging me to follow. I clenched my jaw, ignored it, pressed on. Minutes blurred into hours. My legs ached, my throat burned from breathing the damp air. Still no road, no familiar landmarks, nothing but endless gray. Panic gnawed at me, but I shoved it down. I had to believe that if I kept walking, eventually I would find something. Then the fog shifted. A darker shape emerged ahead, tall and narrow. My heart leapt, convinced it was a tree I recognized. But as I approached, the shape clarified into something else. A figure. Tall, skeletal, its limbs crooked. The same one I had seen in the doorway the night before. It stood perfectly still, head tilted, watching. I froze, my stomach dropping into ice. Slowly, I took a step backward. The figure didn't move. Its outline blurred slightly in the mist, like smoke struggling to hold form. Then another figure appeared to its left. Then another to its right. And another. Within moments, the mist was full of them, dozens, maybe hundreds, surrounding me in every direction. Silent, unmoving, watching. My body went cold. I spun in circles, searching for an opening. But wherever I turned, they were there, stretching into the fog, shoulder to shoulder, a wall of impossible shapes. My chest heaved, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. For a moment I considered running headlong into them, trying to push through, but every instinct screamed that to touch them would mean something worse than death. Then, as though responding to my fear, they began to move. Not closer, not yet, but swaying. All of them, in perfect unison, rocking side to side like trees in a wind that didn't exist. The sight shattered something inside me. I stumbled backward until my legs buckled, and I fell to my knees. That was when the whispering returned. Not faint this time, not half-heard. Loud. Clear. The voices came from the figures themselves, overlapping, weaving into a chorus that filled the air. You belong. You stay. You forever. The words layered, repeated, twisting into chants. My hands clamped over my ears, but it did nothing. The voices vibrated through the mist, through my bones, through my skull. My vision blurred, spots dancing before my eyes. I screamed, though my voice was swallowed by theirs. I don't know how long it lasted. Seconds, minutes, hours. When the chanting finally ceased, I was lying face down in the wet leaves, shaking violently, throat raw. I lifted my head, desperate to see if they were gone. The mist had thinned. The figures were still there, but farther away now, retreating into the fog. I staggered to my feet, dizzy, clinging to the hope that maybe I had broken free of their circle. I turned, searching for direction, and my stomach dropped. The cabin stood behind me, not miles away, not hidden, but only a dozen steps back, squatting in the mist as if it had followed me. My legs nearly gave out again. I had walked for hours. I had pushed until my body was raw, and yet here it was, waiting. A sob tore out of me, ragged and broken. I slammed my fists against my skull, desperate to wake from what had to be a nightmare, but the sting of pain reminded me it was all real. My choices narrowed to two: collapse here in the fog until whatever those figures were closed in on me, or return to the cabin. Neither was survival, but one at least offered walls. I stumbled back inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the mist seemed to retreat, curling back from the door as though satisfied. I collapsed onto the cot frame, burying my face in my hands, weeping until nothing came out but dry heaves. When I lifted my head, new words were carved into the wall above the table. S-U. Rage flared, sharp and bitter. I threw the overturned table against the wall, sending splinters flying, screaming until my throat tore. I shouted at the walls, at the words, at the unseen watchers. Why me? What do you want? Why won't you let me go? The cabin answered. The floor trembled, boards rattling beneath me. The stove door flew open with a metallic bang, belching a gust of air that smelled like charred flesh. The cot collapsed under me as its frame splintered, and from every wall, deep groans vibrated, voices too low to be human. Through the chaos, one phrase formed clearly, spoken by dozens of voices at once. You already ours. The walls shuddered, and for a moment I thought they would close impel. But instead, they stretched outward, bending unnaturally. The cabin grew larger, the ceiling rising into darkness, the corners pulling away until the room became a cavern of shifting shadow. My flashlight beam was swallowed almost instantly, useless against the immensity. Shapes moved in the new darkness. Not just the tall, skeletal figures, but smaller ones too, hunched, crawling, skittering along the edges of my vision. Their eyes glowed faintly, pinpricks of sickly yellow light. My stomach turned as I realized the cabin hadn't just trapped me, it had opened a door, and something was coming through. The whispers rose again, louder, surrounding me in a storm of sound. I stumbled backward until I hit what should have been the wall, but my hand pressed into something soft and wet instead of wood. I yanked it back with a cry, my palm coated in a dark, sticky substance that smelled of iron. I turned and ran. There was no thought, only raw instinct. I sprinted toward the doorway, though it seemed impossibly far now, shrinking into a pinpoint of light. The whispers swelled, the shapes closing in. I could feel hands brushing against me, claws grazing my arms and legs, but I didn't stop. I hurled myself forward, crashing through the doorway into blinding gray mist. I fell hard onto the ground outside, the breath knocked from my lungs. When I looked back, the cabin stood as it always had, small, one room, silent. The door hung slightly open, darkness yawning within. I crawled away, every muscle trembling, eyes fixed on the cabin as though expecting it to lunge after me. But it didn't move. It simply waited. The mist curled thicker again, hiding the trees, swallowing the clearing. I clutched the flashlight, though the beam was weak, and forced myself to crawl farther into the fog. My body screamed for rest, but terror kept me moving. I had escaped the cabin, at least for now, but I knew the truth. I hadn't left it behind. It was inside me now. Every whisper still echoed in my skull. Every shadow seemed to lean closer when I blinked. The word Farvar branded itself behind my eyes, no matter how hard I tried to shake it. The cabin had made its claim, and I was not free. Not really. The fog closed around me, and I kept crawling, then stumbling, then forcing myself into something like walking. Every step felt useless, every direction identical. My body throbbed with exhaustion, my throat raw from screaming, my chest tight with the weight of despair. Yet I couldn't stop. If I stopped, I knew the figures would gather again, swaying in the mist, chanting me into madness. I don't know how long I wandered. Time had dissolved into something meaningless. Sometimes the mist thinned, and I thought I glimpsed shapes of roads, fences, even a lamppost. I would rush toward them, hope surging like fire, only for the vision to dissolve back into endless gray there. Times the mist grew so thick I couldn't see my own hands, and the silence pressed against me until my own heartbeat felt like a violation. At one point I collapsed to my knees, body shaking, tears streaming silently. I whispered to no one, "Please, just let me go." My voice was so faint I wasn't sure I had spoken at all. The fog seemed to ripple in answer, shifting in ways that felt deliberate. Through the haze, the cabin appeared again. I let out a broken laugh. It was everywhere, always waiting. No matter how far I walked, no matter how I fought, it found me. The squat shape stood 30 feet ahead, door ajar, darkness yawning inside. The mist curled lovingly around it, parting as if in reverence. Something inside me cracked for good then. Rage, grief, terror. They all collapsed into numbness. I couldn't escape. I couldn't fight. The only choice left was whether I would go willingly or be dragged. And I couldn't bear the thought of their hands on me again, their whispers crawling into my bones. So I staggered forward on trembling legs and stepped back inside. The door closed behind me without a sound. The cabin was different now. Larger again, but not cavernous like before. The walls leaned closer, pulsing faintly as though breathing. The carved words remained, but more had joined them, covering every surface. Stie, Bielange Ours Farvar, etched so deep the boards looked like open wounds. The air was heavy, almost liquid, pressing into my lungs with each breath. My flashlight flickered, then died completely. Darkness swallowed me whole. But I wasn't blind. Not anymore. My eyes adjusted quickly, though no light existed. I could see shapes moving within the black, flickering forms that leaned from the walls and ceiling. Their faces glowed faintly, pale and twisted, hollow-eyed. The tall figures emerged from the corners, limbs stretching unnaturally, swaying in unison. They surrounded me, silent this time, watching, waiting. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My throat locked, my chest heaving in shallow gasps. I backed against the wall, but the wood was soft again, damp, pulsing faintly like flesh. It quivered beneath my hands. The figures leaned closer. One of them broke from the circle. It stepped forward, towering over me, its head tilting until its hollow face was inches from mine. The air grew colder, my breath fogging between us. Slowly, it lifted a hand, fingers impossibly long, and pressed it against my chest. The moment it touched me, the whispers returned, not in the air this time, but inside my skull. Thousands of voices, all at once, filling every crevice of thought. They weren't words anymore, not exactly. They were commands, truths, inevitabilities. I didn't just hear them. I understood them. They weren't trapping me in the cabin. They were making me part of it. The realization tore through me with unbearable clarity. The figures weren't visitors or intruders. They were what remained of others before me. Hunters, travelers, the unlucky who had stumbled into this place and never walked away. They hadn't been killed. They had been absorbed. Their fear, their flesh, their souls had become the boards, the whispers, the shadows. The cabin wasn't haunted by them. The cabin was them, and now it wanted me to join. I thrashed, screaming wordless defiance, shoving the figure back with every ounce of strength I had. My body reacted with desperation, even as my mind collapsed under the weight of their truth. For a moment the whispers faltered, the figures swaying as if surprised. I bolted for the door, my only thought escape, escape, escape. But when I yanked it open, there was no clearing, no forest, no mist. Only blackness stretched beyond, infinite and empty. I staggered back, stomach twisting, realizing there was no outside anymore. The cabin had swallowed everything. The world I knew was gone. The figures advanced again, patient, certain. I backed into the center of the room, knife trembling in my hand. My last pathetic weapon. My last shred of will. The voices surged, overlapping in a roar that shook the floor. I clapped my hands over my ears, but they bled through, crushing me from inside. I realized then that death might be my only way out. The thought came sudden but clear. If I died before they could take me fully, maybe they couldn't bind me. Maybe my soul wouldn't become another whisper in these walls. My knife felt heavy in my grip, blade dull but sharp enough to pierce skin. My hand shook violently as I raised it to my chest, but the figures reacted instantly. The voices cut into sharp screams, furious, desperate. The cabin shook violently, boards cracking, walls convulsing. They didn't want me dead. They wanted me alive, afraid, surrendering. The realization filled me with a strange, final strength. If they feared my death, then maybe that was victory. I pressed the blade against my chest, tears streaming down my face, whispering to myself, "You can't have me." The figures loomed closer, arms outstretched, whispers twisting into pleas now, begging me to stop. For the first time, they sounded afraid. With every ounce of will I had left, I drove the knife inward. Pain exploded, hot and sharp, flooding my chest. My legs buckled, the room spinning. The figures shrieked, their voices warping into a roar of rage and loss. The cabin convulsed violently, boards splintering, ceiling collapsing inward. I fell to the ground, warmth spreading beneath me, vision blurring. The last thing I saw was the cabin tearing apart from the inside, figures unraveling into smoke, words splitting into splinters, shadows screaming into the void. The last thing I heard was silence, and then, nothing. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying on the ground beside my truck. Morning sunlight warmed my skin. Birds called in the trees. The road stretched ahead, ordinary and calm. For a long time I lay there, gasping, clutching my chest. My shirt was torn, stained dark, but the wound was gone. No blood, no scar, only a dull ache where the knife had pierced. The truck started on the first turn of the key. I drove until I reached the nearest town, until I saw people again, until the noise of ordinary life wrapped around me like armor. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that part of me never left that cabin. At night, when I close my eyes, I hear whispers. Not loud, not constant, just faint, curling at the edges of sleep. Sometimes they say my name. Sometimes they repeat that single word forever. And sometimes, when the house is still and the world outside is silent, I swear I smell mildew and smoke, and I feel the walls breathing. I don't tell these things to scare you. I tell them because they are true. If you ever find yourself stranded in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and someone tells you of an old cabin hidden deep in the woods, don't dismiss their warnings. Don't go looking for it, and if you stumble across it by accident, turn back. Walk through the night if you must, because if you step inside, it won't ever let you go. My name is Daniel Whittaker, and for the last 12 years I have served as a forest ranger in the Pacific Northwest. When I was first issued my badge and the green uniform, I felt an almost solemn weight in my chest, as though I had been entrusted not just with maintaining trails and monitoring wildlife, but with standing watch over something older and deeper than any regulation manual could describe. I often thought of the dense forests, the sweeping mountains, and the endless rain as a cathedral. Each tree was a column, each moss draped limb a gesture toward heaven. Yet what I experienced one particular night reminded me that cathedrals can also be crypts, and that the silence of the forest can be less like a prayer and more like the hush before a scream. I had taken the assignment to the Harlow District, an expanse of national forest that stretched for hundreds of square miles, because I loved solitude. It was a landscape of towering firs and cedars, thick undergrowth, rivers that cut through valleys, and fog that rolled in so heavy it often seemed to solidify around your boots. It was also a place where legends hung in the air like mist. Locals talked about shadowed figures, lights flickering between trunks, or voices drifting where no human could stand. Most rangers dismissed such stories as products of imagination, the mind's way of reshaping wind and distance into something uncanny. I told myself I did too, though some small part of me kept those stories folded carefully at the back of my mind, as though they were maps I might one day need. The night I am about to describe began uneventfully. I had been tasked with checking the northern boundary of the district, near a trail that had been closed after windstorms brought down several massive trees. The closure tape had a habit of vanishing, sometimes from weather, sometimes from hikers who thought rules were optional. It was my job to ensure the area stayed clear until crews could return to finish cleanup. I loaded my pack with the essentials: radio, flashlight, field notebook, extra batteries, and a thermos of coffee that steamed into the damp night. My truck carried me as far as the logging road would allow, but beyond that it was boots and silence. By the time I started up the trail, twilight had surrendered to darkness. Out here, night fell heavy and absolute. There were no nearby towns, no highways spilling light into the sky. Only the faint glow of the stars pressed through gaps in the canopy, and even that was smothered by drifting clouds. I kept my flashlight low, sweeping it across the trail. The beam cut through ferns and slick bark, glinting off puddles left from recent rain. My boots sank into mud in places, sucking with every step. I was used to it, but that night each sound seemed magnified. The squelch of earth, the snap of a twig, the steady rhythm of my own breath. After an hour of hiking, I reached the section where fallen timber had turned the trail into a tangle. Massive trunks sprawled across the path like the bones of giants. I examined the closure tape. It was still in place, fluttering faintly in the damp breeze. Satisfied, I recorded the condition in my notebook. That should have been the end of it. But something in the air kept me standing there, reluctant to turn back. The forest was too quiet. Normally, even at night, there were rustlings, mice in the underbrush, owls shifting on branches, the distant bark of coyotes. Instead, silence pressed in from all sides. I felt as though I had stepped into the pause between heartbeats. I tried to shake it off, and began my return down the trail. My flashlight flickered once, a brief pulse as though the batteries had been drained, though I knew I had loaded new ones earlier. I tapped it, and the beam steadied, though I noticed it seemed weaker, as if the darkness were swallowing more than usual. That was when I heard the first sound: a bell, a single, low-tolling note that carried through the trees. I stopped cold. The sound seemed impossibly close, yet at the same time it stretched into distance, echoing in ways the forest should not allow. I turned slowly, my light playing across trunks slick with moss, but nothing moved. The Harlow district had no churches, no cabins with bells, no reason for such a sound to exist out here. The note faded, leaving behind an emptiness that felt even heavier than silence. I stood rooted to the trail, listening, waiting. Then it came again. 2 tolls, this time slower, deeper, like the breath of some enormous animal. The hair on my arms rose. I told myself it must be something explainable, a piece of metal struck by falling branches, the groan of wood shifting under strain, even distant machinery carried strangely by the wind. But I had walked these woods for years. I knew their language. This sound belonged to none of it. I resumed walking, faster now, trying to convince myself the quickest way to settle unease was simply to return to my truck and head back. Yet the forest had grown unfamiliar. Landmarks I knew, the crooked cedar by the bend, the boulder split by lightning, seemed to vanish. The trail appeared straighter, more featureless, as though something had smoothed away its character. My steps quickened until I was nearly jogging, breath clouding in the chill, and then the beam of my flashlight slid across, something that froze me mid-stride. Just off the trail between the trees stood a figure. It was tall, at least a head taller than me, and shrouded in what looked like layers of cloth, though the fabric did not hang right. It seemed stiff, the folds too sharp, as though carved. Where a face should have been was only a pale oval, blank and featureless. I swung the light back instantly, heart pounding, but the figure was gone. The undergrowth stood untouched, ferns nodding as though nothing had disturbed them. I told myself I had imagined it. Stress, darkness, the mind conjuring shapes from shadows. But I could not deny the bell had been real, nor could I deny the feeling now crawling through me, that I was being watched, measured, even summoned. I forced myself forward, boots slamming the earth, each step meant to drown out fear. The bell tolled again, louder, closer, though my ears could not pin a direction. The sound came from everywhere, as if the trees themselves had hollowed into great throats. My radio crackled on my belt, a burst of static without voice, though I had not touched it. When I lifted it, the dial flickered with faint tones, snatches of whispers that sounded like language just beyond understanding. Then silence, then the bell. By the time I reached the road where my truck waited, sweat had soaked through my shirt despite the cold. The vehicle stood exactly where I had left it, headlights glistening with dew. I climbed inside, locked the doors with a slam, and sat gripping the wheel. My hands trembled. I told myself to start the engine, to leave. But before I could, a shadow shifted across the hood. Something enormous moved between the trees at the edge of the road, so tall it bent branches as it passed. My headlights caught only glimpses, a flash of pale surface like stretched skin, a suggestion of limbs too long. Then it was gone, swallowed by night. The bell tolled once more, so loud I felt it in my chest, vibrating through metal and bone alike. I drove. I did not remember turning the key or shifting gears, only the blur of trees rushing past as I pressed the accelerator harder than I ever had on those rough roads. Even then, the bell seemed to chase me, each toll keeping pace, as though distance had no meaning. When at last I burst onto the highway, the sound ceased. Just like that. Cut off, leaving my ears ringing in its absence. Back at the ranger station, I sat in the parking lot for nearly an hour before I could make myself move. My report that night was brief, sterile, closure tape intact. Trail conditions unchanged. No further action required. I could not bring myself to record more. Who would believe it? Yet even now, years later, I hear that bell sometimes when I close my eyes, and I know the forest remembers me the way I remember it. The following morning, I woke in the ranger station dormitory with a splitting headache, the kind that felt like it had grown roots behind my eyes. Sleep had not come easily. Each time I drifted near unconsciousness, the tolling of that phantom bell would jerk me upright, my heart hammering as though I had been shaken awake by unseen hands. By the time dawn grayed the windows, I had surrendered, dressed stiffly, and tried to settle myself with black coffee that tasted faintly of iron. The rational part of me, the part that had carried me through storms, encounters with black bears, and the quiet terror of lost hikers, kept repeating its mantra. The forest is strange, but it is not malevolent. That had always been my philosophy. Nature was indifferent, vast, and at times cruel, but not intentional in its cruelty. What I had seen last night threatened to overturn that belief. There had been purpose in the tolling bell, an echo that seemed to call not just through the trees, but into me. I told myself I would not mention it. Rangers are practical people. We are trained to document fallen timber, broken bridges, wildlife counts, and weather patterns, not apparitions. Yet silence has a weight, and by midday I found myself lingering at the main office, staring at the bulletin board covered in maps, reports, and incident logs. I considered writing something vague. Unexplained sound, area requires further monitoring, but even that seemed like an admission. My pen hovered, then lowered. I left the paper blank. Still, I could not stay away. That evening, as twilight drew its long shadows, I loaded my truck again. My intention, at least what I told myself, was simple: to confirm with daylight what fear had twisted in the dark. If I walked the trail again and found only wind, water, and earth, I could settle the matter in my own mind. That is what I told myself, though a deeper truth whispered otherwise. That part of me needed to hear the bell again. The road was rough with ruts from logging trucks, the canopy overhead dimming the last of the sun. When I stepped out, the air smelled of cedar and wet soil. I took my time along the trail, moving carefully, noting the signs I had missed in my panic the night before: a cluster of mushrooms glowing faintly against rotting bark, claw marks etched into a fallen log by some passing cugger, a spiderweb trembling with dew. The world was full of details, all of them ordinary, grounding. My breath steadied. I began to believe I had let imagination run away with me. But then I noticed something new. Near the tangle of fallen trees, the earth had been disturbed. A wide impression pressed into the mud, deeper than my boot and twice as long. I crouched, tracing the edges with my glove. It was no print I recognized, not elk, not bear, not even human. The outline seemed half-formed, as though whatever had made it did not quite belong to this terrain. My skin prickled. I told myself it might be erosion, the way rainwater pools and collapses soft ground. But I could not ignore how the impression curved like toes, how the earth at its edge was sharper than water should carve. I marked the location in my notebook, though my handwriting trembled. As dusk returned, the quiet descended again, thick, unnatural. My radio hissed once more, a flutter of static like a breath drawn too close to the microphone. I froze, raising it. "This is Whittaker. Do you copy?" Only silence. Then, faintly, a reply. Except it was not a voice I recognized, nor words I could decipher. The tone was hollow, as if spoken through cavern walls, syllables stretched until they seemed more like groans. My blood iced. I lowered the radio, unwilling to keep it pressed against my ear. The bell came again. One toll. Then another, louder than before, as if the source had moved nearer. I swung my flashlight in every direction, but shadows gathered faster than the beam could cut. The trees themselves seemed to shift, their trunks leaning in, their moss, draped limbs like skeletal arms reaching down. My breath quickened. I began backing down the trail, each step measured, though every instinct screamed to run. And then, something moved between the trees. At first it seemed no more than darkness sliding against darkness, but the shape clarified: long limbs, too many joints, pale skin stretched thin like parchment, and that faceless oval head, luminous in the beam of my light. It stood perfectly still, as though carved from bone. Then, slowly, it tilted. The motion was subtle, a lean as if listening. I did not remember deciding to move, but suddenly I was sprinting, boots hammering mud, lungs clawing at the damp air. The forest blurred around me, branches whipping across my face, roots threatening to catch my ankles. The bell tolled again, louder still, until it felt as though the sound reverberated inside my skull, rattling thought itself. At last the trees thinned, the road opened ahead, and my truck waited like salvation. I slammed the door behind me, hands fumbling at the ignition. The engine roared, tires spitting gravel. I drove until the road gave way to highway, until lights of distant towns blurred against the horizon. Only then did the tolling cease. But the memory did not. Back at the station, I showered with water so hot it scalded, as though heat might burn away the cold that had seeped into me. I stared at myself in the mirror, droplets sliding down my face. For the first time in my career, I considered resigning. Yet when dawn broke again, I found myself at my desk, logging routine patrols, as though the forest had not tried to swallow me whole. 2 days later, a report came in: campers missing from the very region I had patrolled. A family of 3, mother, father, and young daughter, had not returned from their overnight trip. Their last known location was near the northern boundary, close to where I had heard the bell. The search began immediately. Teams of rangers, volunteers, and even county deputies combed the area. Dogs barked, their handlers urging them through brush, though the animals seemed reluctant, noses wrinkling, tails tucked. I joined one of the teams, forcing myself into the woods I now dreaded. We found their campsite quickly. The tent stood, though half collapsed, its nylon walls slashed as if by knives. Inside, sleeping bags lay rumpled, still holding the imprint of bodies. A lantern rested on its side, unbroken, its glass cold. Food had been left uneaten, coffee cups half full. It looked as though they had stepped out for only a moment, intending to return, but they had not. Around the site, the earth told its story. Footprints led away from the tent. 3 sets, clear at first, then gradually confused. The father's prints veered one direction, the mother's another, the child's smaller impressions spiraling aimlessly between. At a certain point, all 3 vanished, swallowed by the mud as though they had stepped into air. Volunteers muttered about abduction, about wild animals, about getting lost in panic. I said nothing. Though my eyes kept drifting toward the trees, I knew what had pulled them. I could feel it watching even now. That night, while the others rested, I sat awake at the edge of camp. The forest loomed around us, black and endless. My radio crackled once again, static rising like breath. This time I did not speak. I only listened. Through the hiss came faint notes, low, resonant, unmistakable. The bell. I wanted to throw the radio into the fire, to silence it forever. But I held it, staring at the device as though it were an open mouth. The sound grew clearer, toll after toll, each one slower, heavier, until I felt my ribs shudder. Then, threaded between the notes, I heard something worse: a child's laugh. I closed my eyes. The missing girl. The laugh was distant yet intimate, as though whispered against my ear. It came again, lighter, this time almost playful. My chest tightened. I rose, clutching the radio, stepping toward the tree line without meaning to. Each toll of the bell guided me. Each laugh pulled like a thread through my ribs. I might have walked into the forest forever, if not for a hand gripping my arm. Another ranger, Coleman, a broad-shouldered man with a voice like gravel, stared at me with furrowed brows. "Where the hell are you going, Whitaker?" The spell broke. I blinked, realized I was already several paces from camp. The radio in my hand had gone silent. I muttered something about needing air, shoved it into my belt, and forced myself back to the fire. Coleman's eyes lingered on me, suspicion written plain, but he said nothing more. Sleep did not come that night, nor the next. The search continued for days, but the family was never found. Eventually, the volunteers drifted away, deputies returned to town, and even the dogs refused to re-enter the woods. The case was closed as presumed lost. Paperwork was filed. Life, as far as others were concerned, went on. But for me, it did not. Every night, when the station grew quiet, I heard the bell, sometimes faint, sometimes deafening, always just beyond explanation. I began to notice shadows where none should fall, glimpses of that pale oval head tilting from the edge of vision. My coffee grew stronger, my hands less steady, my reports more clipped. And still, I could not leave. The forest held me as surely as chains. I knew that if I ran, if I fled to some distant state, The bell would follow. It was not bound by geography. It was bound by recognition. And I had recognized it. One evening, long after the case of the missing family had faded from conversation, I stood alone at the northern boundary again. The closure tape still fluttered, though frayed and weather-worn. The fallen trees lay heavy across the path, blanketed in moss. I raised my flashlight and whispered into the silence. "I know you're here." The bell answered. When the bell answered me, I froze. It wasn't the booming toll of a cathedral tower. It was softer, closer, intimate, as if the sound had formed inside my chest rather than the forest. The vibration rattled through my ribs, a resonance that made my breath stutter. I had spoken into empty air, expecting silence, maybe even hoping my defiance would break the spell. But now, hearing it reply, I realized I had invited something in. The beam of my flashlight shook across the undergrowth. The trees stood still, yet they no longer felt like trees. Their trunks, dark and slick, pressed together in ways that seemed deliberate, like rows of spectators at a performance. I swallowed and took one step forward. The mud clung to my boots, thick and reluctant, but the sound drew me on. For a moment I thought I saw movement, something pale sliding between the trunks, tall and skeletal. I held the light steady, forcing myself not to look away. Nothing revealed itself. And yet I knew it was there, watching, waiting for me to follow. When you spend years in the wilderness, you develop a kind of second sense. Not mystical, not supernatural, just the accumulation of countless hours of listening, watching, learning the rhythm of the land. That instinct had saved me from a bear once, had steered me away from a hidden wasp nest another time. Tonight, that same instinct whispered a truth I didn't want to hear. I was not the one leading this walk. The forest was guiding me. The trail narrowed as I went deeper. Branches clawed my shoulders, snagged my sleeves, as though trying to hold me back. My radio hissed on my belt, sputtering bursts of static. I ignored it. Ahead, the tolling bell grew steadier, each note pulling like a magnet. I don't know how long I walked. Minutes felt stretched into hours, the distance elastic, bending around the sound. My legs ached, my breath clouded in the chill, but I didn't stop. At last the trees opened into a small clearing I had never seen before, though I knew this forest well. The ground dipped into a hollow, and at its center stood a structure. Calling it a structure might not be right. It looked more like a ruin, though one too crude to have been built by any known settlers. Stones had been stacked into a rough circle, their surfaces blackened as if by fire. Most clung to them, but not enough to hide the strange carvings etched into their faces. Lines and spirals that hurt the eye if stared at too long. In the middle of this circle rose a post of rotting wood. From it hung a bell. It was not large, no more than the size of a man's helmet, mottled with rust, its surface green where rain had eaten into the metal. Yet as it swayed gently, the sound it produced filled the clearing, deep and resonant, impossible for its size. Each toll pressed into me, reverberating in bone and marrow. I stepped closer despite every muscle screaming at me to turn away. My light glanced across the carvings. They seemed to shift under the beam, curling into faces. Some human, some not. For a moment I thought I saw the missing family etched there, their eyes wide, their mouths open in silent scream. I blinked hard, and the lines were just lines again. The bell tolled once more. My vision blurred. My knees buckled. I fell into the mud, palms sinking deep. A laugh echoed across the clearing, the same child's laugh I had heard through my radio. Thin, light, yet threaded with something hollow. "Where are you?" I rasped. My voice sounded small. The laugh came again from behind me. I twisted, light swinging wildly. At the edge of the clearing stood the girl, the missing daughter. She looked as she had in the photograph we had circulated during the search. Dark hair, pink jacket, jeans muddied at the cuffs. But her face was wrong, too pale, too smooth, like paper soaked and dried. Her eyes reflected the beam in flat silver discs, no pupils, no whites. She smiled, though it was not the innocent smile of a child. It stretched too wide, lips splitting at the corners. "Come play," she whispered. The bell tolled in answer. I staggered back, mud sucking at my knees. "You're not real," I said, though the words felt brittle. Her smile only widened. She tilted her head, the motion eerily familiar, like the faceless figure I had glimpsed in the trees. Then she turned and slipped into the forest, moving without sound. I wanted to chase her. God help me. Some part of me wanted to follow, to drag her back, to undo whatever had happened. But the bell rang again, louder, shaking the very ground. My flashlight sputtered and died, plunging me into darkness so complete I could see nothing, not even my hand before my face. The sound swallowed everything. The bell became the air itself. I covered my ears, but it throbbed inside me, bypassing flesh and bone. My thoughts unraveled. Images burst behind my eyes, trees growing in reverse, roots tearing free of earth, rivers flowing upward into clouds, faces emerging from bark, mouths opening, screaming without sound. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I was lying on the forest floor, drenched in sweat, chest heaving. My flashlight flickered weakly back to life, as though nothing had happened. The clearing stood empty. The bell was still. The girl was gone. I stumbled out, disoriented, unable to retrace my path. Somehow I found the trail again, though it felt altered, twisted. By the time I reached my truck, dawn had begun to stain the sky with gray. I collapsed into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel like an anchor. Back at the station, I did not file a report. I couldn't. What would I write? Found a haunted bell, spoke with a ghostly child. Instead, I sat at my desk, staring at the blank form until the letters blurred. When Coleman passed by and asked if I was all right, I forced a smile and muttered something about fatigue. He gave me a long look but didn't press. Days passed. I went through the motions, patrols, trail maintenance, paperwork, but my mind remained tethered to that clearing. Every night, the bell echoed in my dreams. Sometimes I saw the girl, sometimes I saw the faceless figure. Always they stood just beyond reach, beckoning. Then came the second disappearance. 2 hikers, both men in their 20s, had failed to return from a weekend trip. Their car was found at the trailhead. Their gear was discovered scattered along the path, as though dropped mid-step. No sign of the men themselves. When the search began, I already knew what we would not find. I tried to speak up. I tried to tell my supervisor, Ranger Hale, that something beyond our understanding was happening out there. But the words caught in my throat. I mumbled instead about dangerous terrain, unstable weather. He nodded, distracted, and moved on. I realized then that the forest had already silenced me. Whatever dwelled in those woods wanted secrecy, and it had wrapped its hand around my tongue. That night, I heard the bell again. Not in my head, not in my dreams, but outside my window. I live in a small cabin not far from the station. Its walls are thin, its windows single-paned. When the sound began, the glass trembled. I rose from bed, every hair standing on end, and peered out. The forest loomed just beyond the clearing, black and endless. And there, at the edge of the trees, stood the faceless figure. Its head tilted. The bell tolled. I shut the blinds, pressed my back against the wall, heart slamming. All night I sat awake, waiting for the door to creak open, for pale hands to reach inside. But nothing came. By morning, the figure was gone. I should have left then. Resigned, packed my belongings, fled eastward until mountains gave way to plains. But I didn't. Maybe I couldn't. The forest had its hooks in me. Instead, I began researching. Old archives in the ranger station, historical records in the county library, even whispered stories from locals who remembered things their grandparents had told them. A pattern emerged: vanishings, always near the northern boundary, dating back more than a century. Families, trappers, prospectors, loggers, entire groups swallowed whole, and always witnesses spoke of a sound. Not all described it as a bell. Some called it a chime, others a hum, a horn, a drone. But the essence was the same, a tone that called and could not be ignored. One story chilled me most. An entry in a miner's journal from 1892, preserved in brittle paper. The sound told in the woods last night. Men say it is the old bell, buried when the mission burned. They say those who hear it are already chosen. I fear we are marked. If we vanish, let it be known the forest has taken us, and the bell rang our passing. The words blurred as I read them again and again. The mission. I had never heard of a mission in this district. If one had stood here, it must have burned long before official records began. But the mention of a bell, buried, my chest tightened. Was that the same one I had seen in the clearing? Had it been unearthed, hung again to toll its curse? I began to suspect the truth was older than the forest itself. The miner's journal left me shaken, in a way the bell itself hadn't. I could not dismiss it as hallucination. Not when I held the brittle paper in my hands. Not when the ink still traced out warnings from men who had walked these woods before me. I photocopied the page and slid the copy into my field notebook, carrying it with me everywhere like a talisman. The words clung to me: if we vanish, let it be known the forest has taken us, and the bell rang our passing. From that day forward, I stopped pretending I could simply continue my duties as if nothing had changed. I did my rounds, yes, but every patrol bent closer toward the northern boundary, drawn as though by gravity. I told myself I was investigating, gathering evidence, but part of me knew the truth. I was circling the bell the way a moth circles flame. One evening, Coleman cornered me in the mess hall. He set his coffee mug down with more force than necessary and studied me with eyes that had grown suspicious. "You're not sleeping," he said flatly. I tried to wave it off. "None of us do during search season." "Don't give me that." He leaned in. "I've seen the way you've been looking at the trees, like they're staring back. What the hell's going on with you, Whittaker?" The truth pressed at my teeth, but I swallowed it. To say it aloud felt dangerous, as though words might invite the bell into him too. "Just tired," I muttered. Coleman's jaw tightened. He didn't believe me, but he didn't press further. When he left, I caught a flicker in the window's reflection, something pale standing among the trees beyond the glass. I blinked, and it was gone. That night the bell followed me into sleep again, but this time I saw more than shadows. I dreamed I stood in the clearing, the ruined circle of stones around me, the bell swaying though no wind stirred. Figures crowded the edges of the trees, dozens of them, their faces blurred as though seen through water. They did not move. They only watched. And in the front row, I saw the missing family. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths slack. The girl reached one hand toward me, and when I tried to grasp it, her skin crumbled like ash. I woke with my sheets damp from sweat and the taste of rust in my mouth. I could not bear it any longer. I had to go back, not as a ranger, not as an investigator, but as a man desperate for answers. The following evening I set out alone, bringing only my flashlight, my notebook, and the copy of the journal entry. No radio this time. I refused to let that hollow static whisper into me again. My boots found the path as though it had been etched into my bones. The forest seemed to anticipate me, branches parting, undergrowth bending. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was not entering the woods, but being pulled into the throat of something vast. When I reached the clearing, the bell hung silent, though I could see it swaying ever so slightly, as if greeting me. I stepped into the circle of stones, heart pounding. The carvings on their surfaces seemed sharper now, the lines curling into shapes I almost recognized. Eyes, mouths, hands reaching. The air was heavy, pressing against my skin. I whispered aloud, voice trembling. "What are you?" The bell answered with a single toll. I staggered, ears ringing. The sound was not heard so much as lived, vibrating through every cell. My vision darkened, then cleared, and I realized I was no longer alone. Figures stood between the trees, just as in my dream. Blurred faces, rigid bodies, watching. The girl was among them, head tilted, silver eyes catching the faint light. Behind her, taller shapes loomed. Too tall, too thin, their heads pale ovals without features. My instinct was to run, but my legs would not move. The bell tolled again, and the figures advanced. Slowly, steadily, they crossed the boundary of the clearing. Their feet did not stir the leaves. They glided. I forced my voice to work. "What do you want?" The girl's mouth opened, and the words that came were not a child's. They were layered, deep and resonant, as though spoken by many voices at once. "We ring."
We gather? Gather what?
I asked, though I already feared the answer. The smile split her face again, and her arms stretched wide. "You." The faceless figures moved closer. The bell tolled in rhythm with their steps, each note pounding my chest. I stumbled backward, tripping against the central post. My hand brushed the bell itself, cold as ice despite the damp air. The moment I touched it, silence fell. Everything froze. The figures halted mid-step. The girl's mouth hung open, her words cut off. Even the sway of the moss in the breeze stilled. My breath echoed in the sudden void. I stood there, palm pressed to the bell, and realized that for the first time I had broken their rhythm. My heart pounded with a fragile hope. Perhaps this was their weakness. Perhaps the bell was not their tool but their prison. Gathering every shred of strength, I shoved the post. The wood groaned, brittle with rot. Again I pushed, harder, until the earth gave way. The post tilted, toppled, and the bell crashed into the mud with a dull thud. The forest exhaled. A rush of air swept the clearing. The figures shuddered, their forms blurring, unraveling like mist in sunlight. The girl shrieked, a sound that split the air like shattering glass. The faceless ones read, their pale heads bending backward, their limbs twisting. One by one they collapsed into nothing, vanishing as though they had never been. And then silence. I stood panting in the ruin of the clearing, the bell half buried in mud, its surface cracked from the fall. The forest seemed lighter, freer, as though a long breath had been released. My knees gave way and I sank to the ground, trembling with exhaustion. But relief was short-lived. As I rose to leave, I heard it. A faint ringing, distant, muffled, as though from underground. The bell on the ground lay still, broken, yet the sound persisted. The earth beneath my feet trembled with each note. I realized with dawning horror that the bell I had seen was not the only one. Perhaps it had never been the true source at all, only a mouthpiece. The real bell lay deeper, older. Buried in the bones of the forest, I fled. I don't remember how I made it back to my truck, how I drove through twisting roads without sleep, how I stumbled into the station at dawn, with mud still caked on my clothes. I only remember the echo of that buried ringing following me, softer now but constant, like a heartbeat in the soil. Coleman found me in the mess hall that morning, hunched over a cup of coffee gone cold. He studied my face, the mud, the trembling in my hands. "You saw something," he said quietly. Not a question, an observation. I wanted to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. He sat across from me, waiting. At last I slid the copy of the journal entry across the table. He read it, jaw tightening, then looked back at me. "You think it's the same bell?" I nodded. He exhaled slowly. "My grandfather used to tell stories. He said there were things older than the trees out here, that settlers tried to bury them, hide them. Maybe they built over them. But you can't bury sound. Not forever. His words chilled me, but also comforted me in a strange way. For the first time, someone else acknowledged the weight I carried. I was not entirely alone. That night, the ringing came again through the walls of my cabin. Fainter, yes, but insistent. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how deep the true bell was buried. How many more had vanished to its call? How long before it rose again? And worst of all, I wondered why it had not taken me yet. The ringing followed me everywhere, faint, persistent, as though the sound had stitched itself into my nerves. At the station, in the woods, even in town when I tried to escape for a night, there it was, humming beneath traffic noise, threading between voices. I stopped trying to drown it with coffee or whiskey. It was inside me now. Coleman noticed the decline. He said nothing outright, but his glances grew longer, more pointed. I could feel his suspicion hardening into certainty. One evening, as we checked supplies in the garage, he finally spoke. "Whatever's in those woods, you brought it back with you." I froze, a wrench in my hand. "That's not how it works." He shook his head. "You don't hear yourself. You talk in your sleep, Whitaker. Names, places. Sometimes you laugh." My stomach twisted. I wanted to argue, but what defense could I offer? He pressed further. "If you don't tell me the truth, I'll tell Hale you're unfit for duty. You'll lose your badge." Something inside me cracked then. The badge, the uniform, they meant nothing compared to the weight of what I carried. "Fine," I said hoarsely. "Come with me. You'll see." The next evening, we set out together. The sun had barely dipped when we reached the northern boundary. Coleman carried a rifle slung over his shoulder, though he knew as well as I did that bullets were useless against whatever haunted these woods. Still, the weapon gave him confidence. For my part, I brought only my flashlight and the journal copy, folded so many times the paper had gone soft. The forest seemed to recognize our intrusion. The silence fell quicker, deeper. Not even insects stirred. Coleman's bravado waned as he scanned the trees, his finger twitching near the trigger. "Where exactly are we going?" he asked. "You'll know," I muttered. The path opened into the clearing. The circle of stones lay unchanged, but the bell I had toppled was gone. Only a shallow hollow remained in the mud, as though it had sunk straight into the earth. Coleman swore under his breath. "What the hell?" I stepped into the circle, heart pounding. The carvings glistened wetly in the beam, sharper than before. I crouched, tracing one spiral with my finger, and felt heat radiating from the stone. Beneath us, the ground trembled with a pulse that matched the ringing in my head. Coleman cursed again, louder this time. "We need to leave." Before I could answer, the sound erupted. The bell tolled, not faint, not buried, but thunderous, shaking the clearing. Coleman staggered, clutching his ears. I stood rigid, the sound vibrating through me, stripping away thought. The trees around us darkened, their trunks stretching impossibly tall, their branches twisting into shapes that resembled fingers. And then they came. Figures emerged from the woods, just as before. Blurred faces, faceless heads, limbs too long. The girl stood among them, her silver eyes gleaming. She raised one hand, pointing at me. Her voice, layered, resonant, rolled through the clearing. "Chosen." Coleman raised his rifle and fired. The shot cracked like thunder, echoing between the trees. One figure jolted, its pale form rippling, but it did not fall. It only turned its blank head toward him, tilting. Another step forward, another toll of the bell. He fired again and again, bullets tearing bark, splintering stone, until the rifle clicked empty. The figures did not flinch. They advanced, their movements in perfect rhythm with the bell. I grabbed his arm. "We can't fight them." "Then what the hell do we do?" His voice cracked with panic. The answer came unbidden. "We'll go down." I didn't know what I meant until I said it, but the moment the words left my mouth, the ground split. The circle of stones shuddered, and the earth beneath the central post cracked open, revealing a black void. The tolling grew louder, pouring upward like smoke. Coleman's eyes widened. "You're insane." "Maybe," I said. "But it's the only way." Before he could stop me, I dropped into the opening. The fall was short, more a slide than a plunge. I landed hard on damp stone, my flashlight clattering. Coleman's curses echoed above, then the scrape of boots as he reluctantly followed. Together we stood in a cavern, its walls slick with moss, its ceiling lost in shadow. And there, in the center, hung the true bell. It dwarfed the one I had seen above. This one was enormous, at least 12 feet tall, suspended from chains that vanished into darkness. Its surface was carved with the same spirals, but deeper, more intricate, shifting when I tried to focus. The sound that emanated from it was constant, not a toll but a hum, low and endless, vibrating the very air. Coleman stared, his face pale. Jesus Christ! The bell's hum sank into me, tugging at every thought, every memory. Images flooded my mind. The missing family, the hikers, the miners of a century past. All of them drawn into this same cavern. All of them standing where I now stood. And deeper still, I felt the pull of something vast. Something that stretched far beyond the Pacific Northwest, beyond this continent, perhaps beyond the world itself. "This is it," I whispered. "The heart of it all." The girl appeared then, though not as a child anymore. She rose from the shadows, her body stretched, her features smoothed into something inhuman. Her eyes glowed silver, her mouth split wide. She spoke with the bell's voice. "Ring, and you are ours. Silence, and you are forgotten." Coleman raised his empty rifle like a club. "Stay back." She did not move. Instead, the chains rattled and the bell swung. The hum swelled into a roar. I staggered forward, covering my ears. My flashlight beam slid across the cavern floor and caught something. Bones, hundreds of them, scattered and piled, gleaming white. Some were human, others not. My stomach lurched. The girl, no, the thing, extended its hand toward me. "Ring," it whispered again. I realized then why it had not taken me before. It didn't want me as prey. It wanted me as participant, as ringer. I turned to Coleman. His face was twisted with terror, sweat dripping. He shook his head. "Don't you dare." But the choice was already in motion. My hand reached for the chain, not entirely under my control. The metal was cold, biting into my palm. The bell loomed above, vast and waiting. For one instant, I thought of smashing the chain, of silencing the bell forever. But deep down I knew the truth. You cannot kill sound. You can only carry it. So I pulled. The bell tolled. The cavern exploded with light, blinding and searing. Figures swarmed from the walls, from the bones, from the very stone itself, all rushing toward the bell, toward me. Coleman screamed, whether in fury or agony, I could not tell. The sound swallowed everything, and then silence. When I woke, I was lying on the forest floor at dawn. The clearing stretched quiet around me. The circle of stones was gone. No carvings, no ruins, no hollow in the earth. Only trees, ordinary and still. Coleman was nowhere to be found. His footprints ended at the edge of the clearing. I called his name until my throat was raw. No answer came. Back at the station, no one asked about him. Hale said Coleman had taken leave, filed the paperwork himself. His cabin stood empty, his belongings gone. It was as though he had never been here at all. But I know better. At night, when the forest falls silent, I hear the bell. Not faint, not buried, but inside me, steady as a heartbeat. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see Coleman standing among the faceless ones, his head tilting in rhythm. I do not know how long I have left before I join him. For now, I write this, not as a report, not as evidence, but as warning. If you find yourself in the forests of the Pacific Northwest and you hear a bell toll where no church stands, do not follow. Do not listen. Do not let it choose you. Because once you hear it, you are already marked.